The first great rupture in the territorial integrity of the Hebrew people occurred in the late 8th century BCE, a consequence of the expansionist policies of the Neo-Assyrian Empire. Following the death of King Solomon, the United Monarchy had fractured into two separate entities: the Northern Kingdom of Israel, comprising 10 of the 12 tribes, and the Southern Kingdom of Judah, centered on Jerusalem. For 2 centuries, these kingdoms existed in a precarious state of rivalry and occasional alliance, but the rise of Assyria under aggressive monarchs like Tiglath-Pileser III fundamentally altered the geopolitical landscape of the Near East. The Assyrians perfected a system of imperial control that relied heavily on the mass deportation of conquered peoples. This policy was not arbitrary cruelty, but a calculated strategy designed to shatter local identities, preempt future rebellions, and integrate diverse populations into the imperial economic and military machine. The Kingdom of Israel first fell under Assyrian influence as a vassal state, paying substantial tribute to avoid outright conquest. However, in the final years of the kingdom, King Hoshea attempted to break free from Assyrian domination by withholding tribute and seeking a military alliance with Egypt, Assyria's primary rival in the region. This act of rebellion prompted a decisive response from the Assyrian monarch Shalmaneser V, who initiated a siege against Israel's capital, Samaria, around 725 BCE. The siege was a protracted and grueling affair, lasting approximately 3 years. The city's fall, likely completed by Shalmaneser's successor, Sargon II, around 722 BCE, marked the end of the Kingdom of Israel as a sovereign political entity. Following the conquest, Sargon II implemented the standard Assyrian policy of deportation. His own royal inscriptions, discovered by archaeologists at his palace in Khorsabad, provide a precise, if propagandistic, account of the event. The annals record the removal of 27,290 inhabitants from Samaria and its environs. These displaced Israelites, representing the elite, the artisans, and the military classes of the Northern Kingdom, were forcibly resettled in distant regions of the Assyrian Empire. Biblical accounts in the Second Book of Kings specify their destinations as Hala, Haber by the river Gozan, and in the cities of the Medes territories corresponding to modern-day northern Iraq, eastern Syria, and northwestern Iran. To complete the cultural and political decapitation of the region, the Assyrians simultaneously repopulated the lands of the former Kingdom of Israel with other conquered peoples from across their empire, including captives from Babylon, Cutha, Ava, Hamath, and Sepharvaim. The intermingling of these foreign settlers with the remaining Israelite peasantry gave rise to the Samaritan people, a community with distinct religious and cultural traditions. Just a quick announcement: if you enjoy this video so far, please subscribe to our channel, as it motivates us to bring you a new story every evening. This is the only kind request tonight, and we won't bother you with it anymore until the very end of today's story. Let's get back to the video. The deported Israelites, scattered across a vast and diverse empire without their political or religious leadership, gradually assimilated into the surrounding Aramean, Assyrian, and Median cultures. Over generations, their distinct tribal identities faded, and their connection to their ancestral homeland dissolved. This demographic absorption gave rise to the enduring historical enigma of the 10 lost tribes. The event served as a catastrophic precedent, a foundational trauma in biblical memory that would be invoked as a dire warning for the Kingdom of Judah, which for a time survived as the sole remnant of the Hebrew monarchies. The reprieve for the southern Kingdom of Judah proved temporary, as the waning power of Assyria gave way to the ascendancy of the Neo-Babylonian Empire under Nebuchadnezzar II. Caught between the ambitions of Babylon and the influence of Egypt, Judah's kings attempted a perilous diplomacy that ultimately led to disaster. The first major confrontation came in 597 BCE, following a rebellion by King Jehoiachin. Nebuchadnezzar's forces laid siege to Jerusalem, and the city's capitulation resulted in a targeted and strategic deportation. This initial exile was not a mass removal of the general populace, but a calculated decapitation of the Judean state. The king, his court, the military elite, and thousands of skilled craftsmen were forcibly resettled in Babylonia. This act stripped Judah of its leadership and technical expertise, leaving behind a rump state governed by a Babylonian-appointed puppet king, Zedekiah. Despite this warning, Zedekiah initiated a final, ill-fated revolt against Babylonian authority a decade later. The response was definitive. Nebuchadnezzar's army returned to Judah and, after an 18-month siege that reduced Jerusalem's population to starvation, breached the city's defenses in 586 BCE. The ensuing destruction was absolute. Solomon's Temple, the physical and spiritual center of Judean religious life for 4 centuries, was systematically dismantled and burned to the ground. The royal palace and the homes of the nobility were demolished, and the city's defensive walls were torn down. Following this devastation, a second, larger deportation was carried out, removing a substantial portion of the remaining population. Cuneiform records from Babylon, such as the Jehoiakim's rations tablets, confirm the presence of the exiled Judean king and his court receiving provisions from the royal storehouses. Unlike the scattered Israelites of the northern kingdom, the Judean exiles were settled in distinct communities, notably around the Chebar Canal, such as the settlement of Tel Abib. Archaeological discoveries, including a collection of cuneiform tablets from a Judean town named Al-Yahudu, Jewtown, reveal that the exiles were not chattel slaves, but were permitted to engage in agriculture, conduct business, and maintain their communal structures. This relative autonomy proved crucial for their cultural survival. The loss of the temple and the homeland precipitated a profound theological and social revolution. Without a central sanctuary for sacrifice, religious practice was forced to evolve. Worship became decentralized and portable, centered on communal prayer, the observance of customs like the Sabbath and circumcision, and most critically, the study of sacred texts. This period witnessed the intensive editing and canonization of the writings that would form the Hebrew Bible. The exile was reinterpreted by prophets like Ezekiel not as a defeat of their God, but as a divine punishment for the nation's failure to uphold its covenant. This theological reframing solidified a universal monotheism, a God not bound to a specific land or temple, but one who could be worshipped anywhere. In the crucible of exile, the Judean people were transformed. Their identity, once tied to a king, a state, and a temple, was reforged around a sacred book and a set of shared laws and practices. This foundational shift ensured their survival as a distinct people and laid the groundwork for the emergence of post-exilic Judaism. The geopolitical equilibrium of the ancient Near East was again transformed with the meteoric rise of the Achaemenid Empire under Cyrus the Great. The Persian conquest culminated in the fall of Babylon in 539 BCE, an event that effectively ended the Neo-Babylonian Empire and ushered in a new era of imperial administration. The Achaemenid approach to governance differed fundamentally from that of its predecessors. Rather than using mass deportation to control subject populations, Persian policy favored a form of multicultural imperial management. This strategy involved co-opting local elites and patronizing native cults to foster loyalty and ensure administrative stability across a vast and diverse territory. This imperial doctrine is most clearly articulated in the Cyrus cylinder, a cuneiform inscribed clay artifact discovered in the ruins of Babylon. While the cylinder does not mention the Judeans by name, it outlines a general policy of repatriating displaced peoples and restoring their local sanctuaries, framing Cyrus as a liberator chosen by the Babylonian god Marduk. Biblical texts, particularly in the books of Ezra and Isaiah, present a specific application of this policy to the Judean exiles. In 538 BCE, Cyrus issued a formal edict permitting their return to Judah, which was now designated as the Persian province of Yehud. The decree went beyond mere permission, offering imperial sanction and material support for the reconstruction of the temple in Jerusalem. According to the Book of Ezra, the Persian treasury was ordered to finance the project, and the sacred temple vessels that Nebuchadnezzar had seized were catalogued and returned to the community's leaders. The return itself, however, was not a universal movement. a significant and prosperous Judean community had taken root in Babylonia, and many chose to remain. The initial wave of repatriation was a partial and organized affair, led by a figure named Sheshbazzar, identified as a prince of Judah, likely a descendant of the Davidic line appointed as the first Persian governor of Yehud. Biblical sources state that this first group of returnees numbered over 42. Their primary objective was the restoration of the central cultic site, a project that faced considerable obstacles upon their arrival. They found a sparsely populated and economically devastated land. Furthermore, they encountered political friction from the Samaritans and other neighboring groups who had established themselves in the region and were suspicious of this Persian-backed restoration project. The rebuilding of the temple would be a protracted process, halting for periods due to these local conflicts, and only being completed decades later under the leadership of Zerubbabel and the prophetic encouragement of Haggai and Zechariah. The decree of Cyrus, therefore, did not mark a restoration of political sovereignty, but rather the creation of a semi-autonomous temple state under the suzerainty of the Persian Empire. This pivotal moment established the foundations of Second Temple Judaism, a community whose religious life would be centered on a rebuilt sanctuary, but whose political existence was defined by its status as a subject of a foreign power. The collapse of the Persian Empire under the conquests of Alexander the Great brought Judea into the orbit of Hellenistic civilization. For over a century, the province was a relatively quiet territory under the suzerainty of the Ptolemaic dynasty of Egypt. This period facilitated a gradual process of cultural osmosis, where Greek language, customs, and philosophical ideas began to permeate Judean society, particularly among the urban aristocracy and priestly classes in Jerusalem. This internal division between Hellenizing factions and traditionalists intensified after 200 BCE, when control over Judea shifted to the Seleucid Empire based in Syria. The breaking point was reached under the reign of Antiochus IV Epiphanes, a monarch determined to unify his diverse empire under a Hellenistic cultural and religious framework, partly to counter the growing power of Rome. Antiochus's policies toward Judea escalated from political interference to an unprecedented campaign of forced Hellenization. In 167 BCE, he issued a series of decrees aimed at the complete eradication of Jewish religious practice. Observance of the Sabbath, traditional festivals, and dietary laws was prohibited under penalty of death. The possession and study of Torah scrolls were declared capital offenses, and circumcision was outlawed. The persecution culminated in the desecration of the Second Temple itself, which was rededicated to Zeus Olympios, and an altar was erected upon which swine were sacrificed. This systematic assault was not merely an attempt at syncretism. It was a direct and violent effort to extinguish the core tenets of Jewish monotheism and cultural identity. The response was not submission, but armed insurrection. The revolt began in the rural town of Modian, ignited by an aged priest, Mattathias of the Hasmonean family, and his 5 sons. After refusing to perform a pagan sacrifice and killing a Hellenizing Jew who volunteered, Mattathias and his sons fled to the Judean hills, launching a guerrilla war. Leadership soon passed to his 3rd son, Judah, who earned the epithet Maccabee, or the Hammer, for his military prowess. Judah Maccabee proved to be a masterful tactician, exploiting his intimate knowledge of the rugged terrain to neutralize the numerical and technological superiority of the Seleucid professional armies. He consistently avoided pitched battles, instead relying on ambushes, night raids, and rapid maneuvers to inflict a series of stunning defeats on Seleucid forces. This campaign was as much a civil war as a war of liberation, with the Maccabees fighting both the Seleucid state and their Hellenized Jewish opponents. After 3 years of conflict, Judah's forces successfully drove the Seleucid garrison from most of Jerusalem. Their first act was to cleanse and rededicate the defiled temple, an event commemorated in the festival of Hanukkah. While Judah secured religious freedom, the fight for political sovereignty would continue under his brothers Jonathan and Simon, who skillfully navigated Seleucid dynastic rivalries. The struggle ultimately resulted in the establishment of the Hasmonean dynasty, which secured a period of independent Judean rule for the first time in over 400 years. The century of Hasmonean independence, born from the Maccabean struggle, ultimately unraveled not from external threats, but from internal decay. By the mid-1st century BCE, the dynasty was consumed by a debilitating civil war between two brothers, Hyrcanus II and Aristobulus II. Their conflict over the dual offices of king and high priest fractured the state, paralyzing its ability to project a unified front as a new, formidable power expanded across the eastern Mediterranean. The Roman Republic, having methodically dismantled the remnants of the Seleucid Empire, was now the undisputed arbiter of regional politics. The architect of this eastward expansion was Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus, or Pompey the Great, who was concluding his successful campaigns against Mithridates of Pontus and Tigranes of Armenia. Both Hasmonean factions made the critical error of appealing to this external authority for arbitration. In 63 BCE, emissaries for both Hyrcanus and Aristobulus presented their cases to Pompey in Damascus, offering significant tribute in exchange for Roman endorsement of their respective claims. This invitation provided Pompey with the legal pretext to intervene directly in Judean affairs and assert Roman dominance over a strategically valuable territory. After initially favouring Hyrcanus, Pompey marched his legions into Judea when Aristobulus's supporters defied Roman authority. The political division within Jerusalem became a military liability. While the faction supporting Hyrcanus opened the city gates to the Romans, the partisans of Aristobulus fortified themselves within the heavily defended Temple Mount complex. What followed was a 3-month siege. Roman military engineering proved decisive. Siege engines were brought to bear against the temple's walls, and after a breach was made, the legions stormed the sacred precinct. The Roman historian Josephus records a significant slaughter occurring within the temple grounds. The conquest's most profound impact, however, was symbolic. In a move that constituted a grave religious desecration in the eyes of the Jewish population, Pompey and his senior officers entered the Holy of Holies, the innermost sanctuary of the temple, accessible only to the high priest on the Day of Atonement. While Pompey did not plunder the temple treasury, this act of entering the sacred space was an indelible assertion of Roman power over Judea's most holy site. The political consequences were immediate and severe. The Hasmonean kingdom was dismembered. Judea was stripped of its coastal cities, Samaria, and territories in the Decapolis, reducing it to a truncated client state. Hyrcanus II was reinstated as high priest, but was denied the title of king, his authority now entirely dependent on Roman goodwill. Aristobulus II and his family were taken as prisoners to Rome to be paraded in Pompey's triumph. This event marked the definitive end of Jewish political independence and the beginning of direct Roman suzerainty. The imposition of tribute, the installation of a Roman governor, and the memory of the temple's violations sowed deep-seated animosity that would define Judeo-Roman relations and set the stage for the catastrophic revolts of the following centuries. The century following Pompey's conquest was characterized by simmering resentment, punctuated by sporadic outbreaks of violence. A succession of inept and venal Roman procurators, combined with oppressive taxation and cultural friction, steadily eroded any remaining goodwill. This volatile environment was further charged by the rise of messianic and apocalyptic expectations, alongside radical revolutionary factions, most notably the Zealots, who advocated for armed insurrection against Roman rule. The final catalyst for a full-scale uprising occurred in 66 CE. The immediate triggers were twofold. The procurator Gessius Florus plundered the temple treasury, and simultaneously a riot erupted in Caesarea over the civil rights of its Jewish population. In response, Eleazar ben Hananiah, a captain of the temple guard, successfully persuaded the priesthood to cease the daily sacrifices offered on behalf of the Roman emperor, an act of open rebellion. The initial phase of the revolt was marked by surprising rebel successes. The Roman garrison in Jerusalem was besieged and annihilated, and a punitive expedition led by the Syrian legate, Cestius Gallus, was ambushed and routed in the ascent of Beth Horon, losing its eagle standard. This humiliating defeat for Rome galvanized the rebellion, transforming it from a localized uprising into a province-wide war for independence. A provisional revolutionary government was formed in Jerusalem, which began minting its own coins and organizing defenses. The Roman response was methodical and overwhelming. Emperor Nero dispatched his most experienced general, Vespasian, at the head of 3 legions and substantial auxiliary forces, totaling some 60 professional soldiers. Vespasian's strategy was not to march directly on Jerusalem, but to systematically pacify the surrounding regions, starting with Galilee in 67 CE. This brutal campaign crushed rebel resistance in the north and isolated the capital. The historian Josephus, initially a rebel commander in Galilee, was captured and subsequently chronicled the war from the Roman perspective. As Vespasian subdued the countryside, the revolutionary leadership in Jerusalem descended into a ruinous civil war. Competing zealot factions fought for control of the city, terrorizing the populace and executing anyone suspected of moderation. This internecine conflict severely depleted their strength and resources long before the main Roman assault began. Following Nero's death and the ensuing Year of the 4 Emperors, Vespasian himself claimed the imperial throne in 69 CE. He departed for Rome, leaving his son Titus to conclude the war by besieging Jerusalem in 70 CE. The Roman legions encircled the city with a wall of circumvallation, cutting off all supplies and escape routes. The siege was a masterpiece of Roman military engineering, employing massive siege towers, battering rams, and catapults against the city's formidable defenses. Inside the walls, the situation deteriorated into catastrophic famine and continued factional bloodshed. After a 5-month siege, the Romans breached the final defenses. In August of 70 CE, the Second Temple was stormed and, according to Josephus, accidentally set ablaze amidst the chaotic fighting, although Titus's direct responsibility remains a subject of historical debate. The sanctuary, the central institution of Judaism for 6 centuries, was utterly destroyed. The city was razed, its population slaughtered or enslaved, and the province of Judea was left in ruins, fundamentally altering the course of Jewish history. The destruction of the Second Temple in 70 CE was not merely a military victory for Rome. It was a profound demographic and theological cataclysm for the Jewish people. The war left Judea depopulated, with contemporary accounts, though likely exaggerated, speaking of over 1 million casualties and nearly 100,000 individuals sold into slavery. The province was placed under direct imperial administration, governed by a legate of praetorian rank commanding the 10th Legion, which was now permanently garrisoned in the ruins of Jerusalem. This military occupation ensured that no new center of political resistance could emerge. To commemorate his victory, Emperor Vespasian initiated the construction of the Colosseum in Rome, a project partially financed by the spoils of the war, including the sale of Jewish captives. Beyond the physical devastation, the Flavian dynasty imposed a punitive and deeply humiliating measure known as the Fiscus Judaicus, or Jewish tax. This was a 2 drachma tax levied annually on all Jews, men, women, and children throughout the entire Roman Empire. The amount was intentionally symbolic, mirroring the half-shekel tax that Jews had voluntarily contributed for the upkeep of the temple in Jerusalem. Now, this same sum was forcibly collected by Roman authorities and redirected to the treasury of the Temple of Jupiter Capitolinus in Rome, the most important pagan sanctuary in the empire. This act transformed a sacred offering into a penalty for rebellion, forcing Jews to financially support a pagan cult and constantly reminding them of their subjugated status and the loss of their own central shrine. The tax was ruthlessly enforced and later expanded under Emperor Domitian, making it a powerful instrument of state control that legally defined Jewish identity for fiscal purposes across the Roman world. With the sacrificial cult rendered impossible, the very foundation of Jewish religious practice was eliminated. The priestly aristocracy, particularly the Sadducees, whose authority was intrinsically tied to temple ritual, vanished as a coherent force. In this vacuum, the seeds of a new religious paradigm, which had been developing for centuries, came to full fruition. Leadership and authority shifted decisively to the sages, the intellectual heirs of the Pharisees. According to rabbinic tradition, the scholar Yohanan ben Zakkai escaped the siege of Jerusalem and received permission from Vespasian to establish an academy at Yavna. This center became the nucleus for the reconstruction of Jewish life. Here, the sages began the monumental task of adapting and codifying Jewish law for a world without a temple. Prayer, Torah study, and acts of loving kindness were formally articulated as substitutes for sacrifice. The synagogue, already a widespread institution, now fully replaced the temple as the locus of Jewish communal and spiritual life, laying the groundwork for rabbinic Judaism and ensuring the faith's survival in a new diasporic reality. The 4 decades following the Flavian suppression of Judea did not extinguish the embers of rebellion. They merely displaced them. While the homeland remained under heavy military occupation, vast and prosperous Jewish diaspora communities throughout the eastern Mediterranean became the new centers of unrest. In 115 CE, with Emperor Trajan and the bulk of the eastern legions deeply committed to a major campaign against the Parthian Empire, a window of military opportunity opened. What erupted was not a centrally coordinated revolt, but a series of near-simultaneous and exceptionally violent uprisings across the provinces of Cyrenaica, Egypt, and Cyprus, a conflict known as the Kitos War. The insurrection began in Cyrene, in modern-day Libya, under a leader whom sources name Lucuas or Andreas, who was proclaimed king. The rebels achieved sweeping initial successes, destroying numerous Roman temples dedicated to deities such as Jupiter, Apollo, and Isis. The violence was directed against the Greek and Roman populations, with the historian Cassius Dio providing accounts of massacres and widespread destruction of infrastructure. The rebellion quickly spread to Egypt, particularly to Alexandria, a city with one of the largest Jewish populations in the world, and a long, bitter history of sectarian strife with its Greek inhabitants. The conflict there was equally brutal, devastating sections of the city, and leading to the destruction of its famed Great Synagogue. A similar uprising on the island of Cyprus was, according to Roman accounts, even more extreme, culminating in the reported massacre of the non-Jewish population of the city of Salamis. The Roman response, though delayed by the Parthian campaign, was methodical and merciless. Trajan was forced to divert critical military assets from his main war front. He tasked one of his most ruthless generals, the Moorish prince Lucius Quietus, with suppressing the insurrections. The war's name is a corruption of his cognomen, Quietus. His legions moved with systematic brutality, first crushing the rebels in Mesopotamia who had risen in support of the diaspora revolt, and then turning their attention westward. In Cyprus, the rebellion was extinguished with such ferocity that a Roman law was subsequently passed forbidding any Jew from setting foot on the island, even in the event of a shipwreck. The suppression of the revolts in Cyrene and Egypt was equally devastating. By 117 CE, the uprisings were completely crushed. The consequences were catastrophic for the diaspora communities. The great Hellenistic Jewish centers of Alexandria and Cyrene, which had been vibrant hubs of Jewish culture and scholarship for centuries, were effectively annihilated. Archaeological layers in these regions confirm widespread destruction dating to this period. The demographic heart of the Jewish diaspora was shattered, its population decimated, and its economic power broken. Lucius Quietus, for his success, was appointed governor of Judea, where his harsh rule only deepened the animosity, creating the volatile conditions for the final and largest Jewish revolt against Rome just 15 years later. The fragile peace in Judea, maintained by a heavy Roman military presence since the Kitos War, was shattered by the policies of Emperor Hadrian. His actions, likely intended as part of a broader program of Hellenization and imperial consolidation, were perceived by the Jewish population as a direct assault on their religious and national identity. In 130 CE, Hadrian visited the region and announced his intention to build a new Roman colony, Aelia Capitolina, upon the ruins of Jerusalem. This plan included the construction of a temple dedicated to Jupiter Capitolinus on the site of the destroyed Jewish temple, an act of profound desecration. Compounding this was an empire-wide edict against bodily mutilation, which was interpreted as a ban on circumcision, a foundational covenant of Judaism. These measures transformed deep-seated animosity into a meticulously planned province-wide insurrection. The rebellion, which erupted in 132 CE, was led by the charismatic figure of Simon Bar Kokhba, who was hailed as a messianic leader and given the name Bar Kokhba, meaning son of a star, by the foremost sage of the era, Rabbi Akiva. This endorsement provided the revolt with immense theological legitimacy, unifying disparate factions under a single, divinely sanctioned commander. Unlike the previous revolts, the initial phase was not a spontaneous uprising, but a coordinated guerrilla campaign. The rebels utilized an extensive network of subterranean tunnels and fortified caves, which had been prepared in advance, to launch ambushes against Roman patrols and supply lines, effectively negating the Romans' advantage in open battle. Their initial successes were stunning. They managed to annihilate or rout Roman forces stationed in the province, including the 22nd Legion Deotariana, and captured Jerusalem. For a brief period, an independent Jewish state was re-established. Bar Kokhba ruled as Nasi or prince over a liberated territory, establishing an administration that minted its own coins inscribed with slogans such as Year One of the Redemption of Israel. The scale of this success forced Hadrian to recognize the revolt as a major war. He dispatched his most capable general, Sextus Julius Severus, from Britain, and amassed one of the largest concentrations of Roman military power ever assembled for a single campaign. Drawing legions and auxiliary units from across the empire, Severus implemented a slow, scorched earth strategy, avoiding direct confrontation and instead systematically isolating and eradicating rebel strongholds, destroying the agricultural infrastructure of Judea as he advanced. After 3 years of brutal warfare, the final bastion of the rebellion was the fortress of Betar, southwest of Jerusalem. Following a lengthy siege in 135 CE, the fortress fell, and Bar Kokhba was killed along with his remaining followers. The aftermath was an unparalleled catastrophe. Roman sources claim that 580 Jews perished in the fighting, and countless others died of famine and disease. Hadrian's retribution was absolute. He permanently forbade any Jewish presence in Aelia Capitolina, and to erase the nation's identity from the map, he officially renamed the province Syria Palestina. The Bar Kokhba revolt was the final and most devastating Jewish war against Rome, marking the definitive end of any hope for political autonomy in antiquity and cementing the shift of Jewish life entirely into the diaspora. With the military suppression of the Bar Kokhba revolt complete, Hadrian's administration moved from punitive warfare to a policy of systematic cultural and demographic erasure. The first and most significant act was the formal implementation of the plan to build Aelia Capitolina. A legal decree was issued, formally expelling all circumcised peoples from the city and its immediate environs, a prohibition enforced on pain of death. This was not merely a restriction, but a legally constituted cleansing of the city's foundational population. Roman legionary veterans, primarily from the 10th Legion Fretensis, along with colonists from other parts of the Greco-Roman world, were settled in the new city. The very layout of Aelia Capitolina was an act of superimposition. It was constructed as a typical Roman polis, with a main north-south thoroughfare, the Cardo, and an east-west road, the Decumanus. A large forum was established, and upon the Temple Mount itself, the sacred center of Judaism, Roman authorities erected pagan sanctuaries, including one dedicated to Jupiter Capitolinus, from which the city derived part of its new name. This physical transformation of Jerusalem was accompanied by a broader administrative reorganization designed to obliterate the political memory of Judea. The province was officially merged with neighboring territories, including Galilee and parts of Syria, and renamed Syria Palestina. The choice of Palestina was a deliberate and calculated insult, invoking the name of the Philistines, the ancient biblical enemies of the Israelites, to sever the intrinsic historical and etymological link between the Jewish people, Judea, and the land of Judea. This act of administrative renaming was a form of damnatio memoriae, a condemnation of memory, intended to permanently erase the national identity of the vanquished from official Roman geography and consciousness. Coins were minted celebrating the foundation of the new colony, further cementing this imperial reality. The prohibition on Jewish entry into Aelia Capitolina was rigidly enforced, but one notable exception was eventually permitted, itself a form of ritualized humiliation. Jews were allowed to enter the city's territory once a year, on the 9th day of the month of Av, the anniversary of the destruction of both the first and second temples, to mourn at the ruins. This access, however, was not granted freely. A fee was exacted by Roman soldiers for the privilege of grieving. The immediate consequence of these measures was a forced demographic shift. The spiritual and administrative heart of the Jewish people, which had been in Jerusalem and Judea for over a millennium, was compelled to relocate. The Sanhedrin, the supreme rabbinic court, along with the Patriarchate, migrated northward into the Galilee, establishing new centers of learning and governance in cities like Usha, Sepphoris, and ultimately Tiberias. It was in this Galilean milieu that the great works of rabbinic Judaism, including the Mishnah, would be compiled, ensuring the continuity of Jewish law and tradition in a world where its geographic center had been rendered legally and physically inaccessible. The fundamental reordering of Jewish existence after Hadrian was not a singular event, but the beginning of a process that would be accelerated and codified with the Roman Empire's adoption of Christianity. The toleration granted to Christians by Constantine in 313 CE and the subsequent elevation of Christianity to the state religion under Theodosius I in 380 CE fundamentally altered the legal landscape for the empire's Jewish inhabitants. Previously, Judaism had been a religio licita, a licensed religion, one among many in a polytheistic empire. In a Christianized state, however, it became the most significant and problematic theological counterpoint. The shift began with early Constantinian legislation that criminalized the conversion of Christians to Judaism and forbade Jews from owning Christian slaves, thereby initiating the use of imperial law to enforce religious boundaries and prevent Jewish influence. This gradual erosion of rights culminated in the Theodosian Code, a comprehensive collection of Roman law promulgated in 438 CE. This code did not call for the physical expulsion of Jews. Rather, it created the legal architecture for their civic and social marginalization. A significant portion of the code was dedicated to defining and restricting their status. Jews were systematically barred from holding public office, serving in the military, or practicing law, effectively excluding them from any position of authority over Christians. The construction of new synagogues was explicitly forbidden, and while repairs to existing ones were sometimes permitted, this was often subject to the discretion of local officials hostile to the Jewish population. The Patriarchate, the central Jewish administrative body which had been tolerated for centuries, was formally abolished in 429 CE, decapitating the Jewish community's internal governance structure. The code also enforced a rigid social separation. Intermarriage between Jews and Christians was prohibited and classified as a capital crime, legally framed as a form of adultery. These laws were not merely discriminatory, they were the legislative expression of a developing Christian theology that viewed Jews as a people both preserved and punished. Patristic writers of the era, such as Augustine of Hippo, articulated the doctrine of witness, which argued that Jews must be allowed to survive, but only in a degraded state, to serve as a perpetual testament to the truth of Christianity and the consequences of their rejection of Jesus. The Theodosian Code translated this theological position into a state-enforced reality. It created a legal framework that would be inherited by the successor barbarian kingdoms and would form the bedrock of European canon law regarding Jews for the next 1,000 years, transforming them into a legally defined, perpetually subordinate caste within the emerging Christian world. While imperial legislation was creating a framework for Jewish subordination, the practical application of this new order often depended on the ambitions of local ecclesiastical leaders. In the early 5th century, Alexandria stood as a volatile metropolis, a center of both Hellenistic learning and fierce theological conflict. Its Jewish community was one of the most ancient and integrated in the diaspora, dating back to the city's founding. The legal status of this community was violently overturned in 414 CE, not by an imperial decree, but through a direct power struggle between the secular Roman state and the ascendant Christian church. The primary antagonists were the imperial prefect, Orestes, who represented the legal authority of the empire, and the newly appointed patriarch, Cyril, a theologian of immense ambition and doctrinal rigidity, who sought to assert the Church's supremacy over all aspects of civic life. The immediate catalyst for the conflict, as documented by the Church historian Socrates Scholasticus, was rooted in civic disturbances common to the city's public life. Tensions escalated after a Christian zealot publicly provoked the Jewish community during a theatrical performance, an act Orestes punished to maintain public order. This assertion of secular authority was perceived by Cyril as a direct challenge. The situation spiraled when, according to Christian sources, a group of Jews orchestrated a nighttime attack, spreading a false rumor that a major church was ablaze. As Christians rushed into the streets, they were ambushed and killed. Whether this was a calculated act of aggression or a desperate, miscalculated response to growing intimidation, it provided Cyril with the justification for an unprecedented and extra-legal response. Bypassing the authority of the prefect entirely, Cyril mobilized his vast network of followers, including the formidable Parabolani, a clerical militia technically employed as hospital attendants but functioning as the patriarch's enforcers. In a swift, organized action, they seized Alexandria's synagogues, converting them into churches. More significantly, they systematically plundered the homes and businesses of the Jewish population and drove the entire community, numbering in the thousands, from the city, effectively ending a presence that had lasted over 700 years. Orestes was powerless to prevent the expulsion. His civic guards were no match for the religious fervor Cyril had unleashed. He lodged a formal complaint with Emperor Theodosius II, but Cyril's theological influence and political connections in Constantinople were formidable, and his actions went unpunished. The expulsion from Alexandria in 414 CE was a watershed moment. It was the first large-scale, violent expulsion of a major Jewish community in the Christian Roman Empire, instigated not by the state, but by the local church, demonstrating that ecclesiastical power could now independently enact policies of physical removal, setting a dangerous precedent for the centuries to come. In the successor kingdoms that emerged from the Western Roman Empire's collapse, the legal framework established by the Theodosian Code formed the baseline for Jewish policy, but its application varied. In Visigothic Spain, the situation for the long-established Jewish population transformed dramatically with the monarchy's own religious evolution. The Visigothic elite, who were Arian Christians, initially maintained a degree of separation from their Nicene Hispano-Roman subjects, a division that afforded the Jewish community a measure of stability. This dynamic was irrevocably altered in 589 CE at the Third Council of Toledo, when King Rechid formally renounced Arianism and embraced Nicene Catholicism, unifying his kingdom under a single faith. This act of political and religious consolidation immediately isolated the Jews as the sole significant religious minority, making them the primary focus of the newly unified Catholic monarchy's legislative zeal. The initial canons of the council were restrictive, forbidding Jews from holding public office over Christians and from marrying them, but it was under the reign of King Sisebut, 600 and 1221 CE, that policy shifted from legal restriction to active coercion. In 616 CE, Sisebut issued a decree that all Jews within the kingdom must either accept baptism or be expelled. This was the first state-sponsored, large-scale forced conversion in Western Europe. While some Jews fled to Francia or North Africa, thousands were compelled to convert, creating a new and problematic social class, the conversos. The sincerity of these conversions immediately became the central obsession of the Visigothic state and church for the remainder of the century. The issue was no longer the presence of Jews, but the perceived threat of crypto-Judaism among the newly baptized. This obsession was legislated through a series of increasingly severe church councils held in Toledo, which functioned as the kingdom's primary religious and legislative bodies. The Fourth Council of Toledo, 633, presided over by Isidore of Seville, while denouncing the use of force in initial conversions, decreed that those already baptized, even forcibly, must remain Christian. It further mandated that the children of conversos be separated from their parents and educated in Christian households to ensure their faith. Subsequent councils escalated these measures. The Sixth Council, 638, required all conversos to sign a placetum, a written pledge renouncing all Jewish practices. The Twelfth Council, 681, enacted a comprehensive set of 28 anti-Jewish laws, which were read aloud in churches and synagogues for the remaining unbaptized Jews, effectively criminalizing the observance of Shabbat, Jewish holidays, and dietary laws. The persecution reached its apex under King Egica at the 17th Council of Toledo in 694, which accused the Jews of conspiring with foreign powers. The council decreed the enslavement of the entire Jewish population, the confiscation of their property, and the forced removal of their children for Christian upbringing, representing a legislative attempt at the total eradication of Jewish identity from the Iberian Peninsula. The emergence of Islam in the 7th century on the Arabian Peninsula introduced a new legal and political paradigm for the region's long-settled Jewish tribes. In the Hijaz, particularly in the oasis city of Medina, then known as Yathrib, Jewish tribes like the Banu Kainuka, Banu Nadir, and Banu Qurayza were deeply integrated into the local economy as agriculturalists, artisans, and financiers. The initial framework for their interaction with the nascent Muslim community was outlined in the Constitution of Medina, a document that established a confederation, or ummah, in which the Jewish tribes were designated as allies, retaining their religion and internal legal autonomy while being expected to contribute to the common defense. This early model of coexistence, however, proved transient as Muhammad's political authority consolidated and theological differences sharpened. The relationship began to break down following the Muslim victory at the Battle of Badr in 624 CE. The first tribe to be expelled was the Banu Kainuka, who controlled a significant market and were prominent goldsmiths. After a dispute escalated into a brief siege, they were exiled from Medina, their property and assets confiscated by the Muslim state. A year later, the Banu Nadir, a powerful landowning tribe, were accused of plotting to assassinate Muhammad. Following another siege of their fortresses, they too were expelled, though they were permitted to leave with the portable property they could carry on their camels, subsequently resettling in the Khaybar oasis to the north. The fate of the Banu Qurayza was the most severe. Accused of treasonous collaboration with the Meccan forces during the Battle of the Trench in 627 CE, the tribe was besieged. Upon their surrender, the men were executed, and the women and children were enslaved, effectively liquidating the last major Jewish tribal presence within Medina itself. These events in the Hijaz, ranging from expulsion to destruction, were foundational in shaping the subsequent legal status of Jews under Islamic rule as the Caliphate expanded. For conquered territories beyond Arabia, a formal, regulated status of subordination was developed for non-Muslim monotheists, known as dhimmi. Under the Pact of Umar, a text formalized later but reflecting early practices, Jews and Christians were granted protection of life, property, and the right to practice their religion. In exchange, they were required to pay a specific poll tax, the jizya, and adhere to a set of discriminatory regulations. These included prohibitions on building new houses of worship, riding horses, bearing arms, and holding authority over Muslims. This dhimmi system created a legally defined and protected, yet permanently inferior, status that would govern Jewish life across the Middle East and North Africa for over a millennium. While the legal status of Jews was being violently redefined in the Christian West and the Arabian Peninsula, the intellectual and authoritative center of Jewish life was solidifying in Mesopotamia, a region the Jews called Babylonia. Here, under the relative stability of the Persian Sasanian Empire, the rabbinic academies that had emerged centuries earlier entered their most creative and influential period. This era, lasting from the 3rd to the 11th centuries, saw the flourishing of institutions that would produce the most significant text in post-biblical Judaism and establish a framework for legal and spiritual governance that would guide the diaspora for a millennium. The two most prominent of these academies were located in the towns of Sura and Pumbedita, which became the undisputed hubs of Jewish learning. Their primary function was the intensive study, analysis, and elaboration of the oral law, which had been codified in the Mishnah around 200 CE. The heads of these institutions, known as the Geonim, Hebrew for geniuses or excellencies, became the supreme religious and legal authorities for Jewish communities far beyond Babylonia. The central intellectual project of the academies was the compilation of the discussions, debates, and rulings surrounding the Mishnah. This monumental undertaking resulted in the creation of the Babylonian Talmud, a vast compendium of law, ethics, philosophy, and folklore that became the central text of rabbinic Judaism. Through meticulous argumentation and the preservation of minority opinions, the Talmud provided a comprehensive system for applying biblical principles to all aspects of daily life, effectively creating a portable legal and cultural homeland in the absence of a sovereign state or central temple. The Arab conquest of the Sasanian Empire in the mid-7th century did little to disrupt the authority of these institutions. The new Islamic Caliphate recognized the existing Jewish communal structure. The lay leader of the community, the exilarch, Resh Galuta, who claimed Davidic descent, was granted formal investiture by the Caliph in Baghdad, and in turn, the exilarch confirmed the appointment of the Geonim. Under early Islamic rule, the influence of the Babylonian academies expanded significantly. Through a system of written correspondence known as responsa, Jewish communities throughout North Africa, Spain, and beyond would send complex legal and religious questions to the Geonim. The authoritative answers, based on Talmudic reasoning, created a unified legal framework that standardized Jewish practice across disparate cultures and political entities, cementing Babylonia's position as the undisputed center of the Jewish world for centuries. The call to crusade issued by Pope Urban II at the Council of Clermont in 1095 was intended to direct the martial energies of the European nobility towards the Holy Land. However, it also unleashed a wave of popular religious fervor that was neither controlled nor sanctioned by the established church hierarchy. Alongside the organized armies of the princes, a more volatile movement known as the People's Crusade coalesced, attracting peasants, urban poor, and renegade knights. Within this movement, particularly in the bands led by figures like Count Emicho of Flonheim, a new and lethal ideology took root. The imperative to confront the infidel was redirected from the distant Muslim to the proximate Jew. The logic articulated was that it was nonsensical to march thousands of miles to fight enemies of Christ, while leaving his alleged murderers to live in prosperity at home. This reinterpretation of the crusading mission transformed a foreign military campaign into a pretext for domestic persecution. The first targets of this popular violence were the ancient and flourishing Jewish communities of the Rhineland, collectively known as Shum, an acronym for Spire, Worms, and Mainz. These were centers of commerce, finance, and, most importantly, Talmudic scholarship that had succeeded the declining Babylonian academies. In May of 1096, the crusading mobs descended upon them. The first assault occurred in Spire, where Bishop John provided refuge for the majority of the Jewish population within his fortified palace, limiting the number of casualties. This act established a pattern of Jews seeking protection from local ecclesiastical or secular lords, a protection that often proved inadequate. Weeks later, the mob reached Worms. Here, after initial killings, many Jews sought safety in the bishop's residence. The Crusaders besieged the compound, and the community inside, faced with the ultimatum of baptism or death, chose mass martyrdom. Hebrew chronicles from the period document acts of collective suicide, with parents killing their children and then themselves to prevent forced conversion, a practice that became known as Kiddush Hashem, the sanctification of God's name. The devastation culminated in late May in Mainz, the largest and most prominent of the three communities. Despite having paid Archbishop Ruthard a substantial sum for protection, the defences of his palace were overwhelmed by Emmiko's forces. The resulting massacre was the most extensive of the campaign, effectively annihilating one of the most important Jewish centres in Europe. Unlike the state-mandated expulsions or legislative oppression of previous centuries, the Rhineland massacres of 1096 represented a new phenomenon in Western Christendom: large-scale, popular mob violence fueled by a toxic combination of religious fanaticism and economic resentment. It marked a catastrophic turning point in Jewish-Christian relations, embedding a precedent for violent pogroms that would haunt Ashkenazi Jewry for centuries. While the crusading fervour brought unprecedented popular violence to the Jews of Northern Europe, a different form of religious intolerance was gathering force in North Africa, poised to dismantle the celebrated Jewish life of Al-Andalus. The Islamic rule in Spain, particularly under the Almoravid dynasty and the preceding Taifa kingdoms, had allowed for a period of extraordinary cultural and intellectual symbiosis, often termed the Golden Age. Although the legal framework of dhimmi status still applied, it was often loosely enforced, permitting Jewish communities to produce renowned poets, philosophers, and scientists who participated fully in the Arabic-speaking high culture. This era of relative security was brought to an abrupt end by the rise of the Almohads, a puritanical Islamic reform movement originating among the Masmuda Berbers of the Atlas Mountains. The Almohad ideology, based on a rigid and uncompromising interpretation of divine unity, Tawhid, was fundamentally intolerant of other faiths and rejected the legitimacy of the established dhimmi pact. Beginning their conquest of Iberia in 1147, the Almohad caliphs systematically dismantled the Almoravid emirates and imposed their stark theological vision. For the Jewish and Christian populations under their new dominion, the policy was not one of regulated subordination, but of forced assimilation. The Almohads presented a clear ultimatum: conversion to Islam, exile, or death. This decree effectively abrogated the centuries-old legal structure that had, for all its discriminatory aspects, guaranteed the physical protection of non-Muslim communities. The implementation of this policy was swift and brutal. Prosperous and ancient Jewish quarters in cities like Córdoba, Seville, and Granada were systematically destroyed. Lucena, a city with a Jewish majority and a famous Talmudic academy, was annihilated as a center of Jewish life. The consequences were immediate and transformative. Faced with an existential threat, the Jewish population of Al-Andalus fragmented. Many chose outward conversion, becoming Anusim who practiced Judaism in secret, a precarious existence under a regime vigilant against heresy. Others were killed in massacres that accompanied the conquests. The largest group, however, chose exile, initiating a mass flight that shattered the demographic and intellectual landscape of Spanish Jewry. This was not a centrally organized expulsion decree in the manner of later European monarchs, but a forced exodus under duress. The refugees scattered, with many fleeing north to the nascent Christian kingdoms of Castile and Aragon, which were actively seeking settlers for newly reconquered territories. Others crossed the Mediterranean to Provence, Italy, or eastward to the Levant. The most significant consequence of this flight was the migration of its intellectual elite, most famously the family of the young Moses Maimonides, who fled Córdoba in 1148. This dispersal of scholars and communal leaders marked the violent termination of the Andalusian Golden Age and irrevocably shifted the centers of Jewish learning and influence. In stark contrast to the religiously motivated violence of the Crusades or the theological intolerance of the Almohads, the first general expulsion of Jews from a European kingdom was an act of calculated state policy, driven almost entirely by fiscal and political expediency. In 1182, the young King Philip II, known as Philip Augustus, issued a decree banishing all Jews from the royal domain of France, an area centered on Paris and the Île-de-France. This event was not the result of a sudden outburst of popular animosity, but the culmination of a deliberate strategy to consolidate royal power and expropriate wealth. Upon his accession to the throne, Philip inherited a monarchy that was still relatively weak, with its authority often challenged by powerful feudal lords. The Jewish community, under direct royal protection, played a crucial role in the economic life of the domain, primarily through money lending, an activity essential to the commerce of the era but forbidden to Christians by canon law. Philip's actions were methodical. In 1180, 2 years prior to the expulsion, he had all Jews within his lands arrested in their synagogues on the Sabbath and demanded an exorbitant ransom of 15 silver marks for their freedom. This initial move served as a direct and massive infusion of cash into the royal treasury. Having extracted this liquid capital, he proceeded to the next phase of his plan. The Edict of Expulsion of 1182 gave the Jewish population a mere 3 months to sell their movable assets and depart the kingdom. The decree's most significant clause, however, was economic. It annulled all outstanding Christian debts to Jewish lenders. A fifth of the value of these loans was to be redirected and paid directly to the crown, effectively constituting a massive one-time tax on Christian debtors and a complete seizure of Jewish financial assets. Simultaneously, the edict declared the confiscation of all Jewish immovable property, including houses, lands, and synagogues. These assets were immediately absorbed into the royal domain, providing the king with valuable urban and rural real estate. The synagogues were promptly converted into churches, a symbolic act that underscored the finality of the expulsion. This policy was a masterstroke of cynical statecraft. It simultaneously enriched the monarchy, erased the debts of the Christian landowning class whose support Philip needed, and removed a distinct legal community that operated outside the standard feudal structure. The 1182 expulsion from the Île-de-France established a new and dangerous precedent in European history: the use of a Jewish minority as a fiscal instrument of the state, subject to systematic arrest, expropriation, and banishment purely for the financial and political benefit of the ruling monarch. Parallel to the state-driven expulsions and popular crusade violence, the High Middle Ages witnessed the fabrication of new theological accusations that fundamentally altered the nature of anti-Jewish persecution. These were not based on economic resentment or political maneuvering alone, but on slanderous myths that demonized the core of Jewish religious practice. The first of these to gain traction was the blood libel, the accusation of ritual murder. Its first documented instance occurred in Norwich, England, in 1144, following the unsolved death of a boy named William. A monk, Thomas of Monmouth, began to promote a narrative that the local Jewish community had ritually crucified the child in a mockery of Jesus' passion, allegedly to use his blood in the preparation of Passover matzah. This charge, unsupported by any evidence, conflated the ancient deicide accusation with contemporary murder, transforming Jews from historical Christ killers into an active, malevolent conspiracy engaged in the ritualistic slaughter of Christian children. The myth proved highly potent and transferable, spreading across Europe and becoming a recurring catalyst for massacres and local expulsions in places like Blois, France, 1171, and Fulda, Germany, 1235. The second major fabrication, the accusation of host desecration, emerged directly from a pivotal development in Catholic doctrine. The Fourth Lateran Council of 1215 formally defined the dogma of transubstantiation, the belief that the consecrated Eucharistic wafer and wine literally become the body and blood of Christ. This theological assertion created a new point of vulnerability. If the host was Jesus' physical presence on earth, it could be profaned. By the mid-13th century, accusations began to circulate that Jews were stealing consecrated wafers from churches to stab, torture, or burn them, thereby reenacting the crucifixion. The first major case leading to mass executions occurred in Paris in 1290. This charge was theologically devastating, portraying Jews not merely as non-believers, but as a community actively and sadistically attacking the physical body of the Christian Saviour. Together, the blood libel and host desecration myths provided a powerful new arsenal for persecution. They were insidious forms of propaganda that required no proof beyond popular fear and superstition, creating a pretext for violence that was self-justifying. They effectively criminalized Jewish existence by framing Jewish religious life itself as a secret, murderous, and demonic cult operating within Christian society. The expulsion of the Jews from England in 1290 represents the first instance of a complete national banishment in medieval Europe, serving as a grim blueprint for subsequent state actions. The act, decreed by King Edward I, was not a spontaneous event, but the logical endpoint of decades of escalating royal exploitation and legislative strangulation. Since the Norman conquest, the Jewish community in England had existed in a unique legal state as direct property of the crown, primarily serving the monarchy and aristocracy as moneylenders. This economic role made them both indispensable and deeply vulnerable. Edward I, a king perpetually in need of funds for his extensive military campaigns in Wales and France, initially continued the practice of imposing crippling taxes, or tallages, on the community. However, their ability to pay was systematically undermined by the king's own policies. A critical turning point was the Statute of the Jewry in 1275. This legislation formally outlawed the practice of usury, thereby eliminating the community's primary economic function without providing viable alternatives. While the statute ostensibly encouraged Jews to become merchants and artisans, they faced immense restrictions from Christian guilds and were barred from owning land. The statute also intensified social segregation by mandating that Jews wear a distinguishing badge. With their financial capacity deliberately crippled, the Jewish community could no longer serve as a reliable source of royal revenue. Having exhausted this traditional source of income, Edward I devised a new political and fiscal strategy. In 1290, in need of a massive grant to fund his wars, he struck a bargain with his parliament. In exchange for their approval of a substantial tax on his Christian subjects, a lay subsidy of 1/15, the king would expel the entire Jewish population. The Edict of Expulsion, issued on July 18th, was a masterclass in financial statecraft. It gave the approximately 30 Jews in England until November honest of that year to leave the realm. The decree stipulated that all their property would be forfeit to the crown, and, most significantly, all outstanding debts owed to them by Christians were to be collected directly by the royal treasury. Edward had effectively traded a dwindling long-term asset for a massive, immediate parliamentary subsidy, while simultaneously seizing all remaining Jewish capital. The expulsion was swift and total, creating a Jew-free England that would persist for more than 350 years, and establishing a chillingly effective model of state-sponsored financial expropriation and ethnic cleansing. The arrival of the Black Death in Europe between 1347 and 1351 unleashed a demographic catastrophe of unparalleled scale, wiping out an estimated third of the continent's population. In the face of inexplicable and widespread death, societies fractured, and the desperate search for a cause turned from divine wrath to human conspiracy. Jewish communities, long marginalized and subject to suspicion, became the primary scapegoats for a disaster they were also dying from. The central accusation that ignited the persecutions was that of well poisoning. A rumor, originating in southern France, rapidly mutated into a continent-wide conspiracy theory, alleging an international Jewish plot to exterminate Christians by contaminating wells, springs, and rivers with a potent poison. This narrative was substantiated in the eyes of the terrified populace through confessions extracted under extreme torture, which were then circulated as proof of guilt. This hysteria triggered a wave of horrific violence, particularly within the fragmented territories of the Holy Roman Empire. The persecutions were not centrally organized, but spread virulently from town to town. In 1348, massacres erupted in cities like Basel, where the Jewish community was rounded up and burned alive on a specially constructed wooden platform on an island in the Rhine. The following year, in Strasbourg, before the plague had even reached the city, the guilds and populace overthrew the city council that had tried to protect the Jews, and proceeded to burn approximately 2,000 people at the stake in the Jewish cemetery. Similar events occurred in Cologne, Mainz, Erfurt, and dozens of other towns. The violence was often a prelude to formal expulsion. The few survivors were banished, and their property and financial records were promptly seized by municipal authorities and local lords. The response from the highest levels of authority was largely ineffective. Pope Clement VI issued 2 papal bulls in 1348, explicitly condemning the violence and declaring the well-poisoning accusations to be baseless lies, pointing out that Jews were perishing from the plague in equal measure to Christians. Emperor Charles IV also attempted to offer protection, but his imperial authority was too weak to override the will of local mobs and city councils. The Black Death persecutions resulted in the near-total destruction of the ancient Jewish communities in the German-speaking lands, leading to a massive demographic shift as survivors fled eastward, seeking refuge in the more tolerant lands of Poland and Lithuania. The Jewish presence in France during the 14th century was characterized by a precarious cycle of royal summons and summary banishment, dictated entirely by the fiscal needs of the Valois dynasty. After being recalled following earlier expulsions, Jewish communities were re-established primarily to fulfill the economic function of moneylending, a role that brought them into direct service of the crown, but also exposed them to popular hostility and royal caprice. The final irrevocable expulsion of 1,394 was not the result of a single crisis, but rather the culmination of a political and ideological shift under the unstable reign of King Charles VI. His periodic descents into severe mental illness, which began in 1392, created a volatile court where competing factions vied for control over royal policy. During the king's episodes of incapacity, power shifted to a regency council heavily influenced by religious hardliners. This faction, which included Queen Isabeau of Bavaria and powerful dukes, saw the Jewish presence as a moral stain on the Christian kingdom. Their influence grew, and they began to advocate for a permanent and definitive removal, moving beyond the cynical expel and recall financial policies of the past. The justification for this final act was framed in religious terms, citing alleged usurious abuses and complaints that Jews were proselytizing among Christians. However, the underlying motivations were multifaceted. The crown, as always, stood to gain financially from the confiscation of all Jewish property and the transfer of all outstanding debts to the royal treasury. Furthermore, the expulsion served as a powerful act of political consolidation, demonstrating the monarchy's commitment to religious uniformity and its power to define the composition of the French nation. On September 17, 1394, Charles VI issued the decree that permanently banished all Jews from the royal domains. Unlike the expulsion of 1182, this edict was intended to be irreversible. The communities were given a brief window to leave, and the state apparatus moved swiftly to liquidate their assets for the crown's benefit. The act effectively ended the history of the medieval Jewish community within the Kingdom of France. While some Jews remained in territories not yet under direct royal control, such as Provence and the papal enclave of Avignon, France proper became, like England a century earlier, a realm officially emptied of its Jewish population. This definitive expulsion marked a new stage in state policy, where total exclusion rather than regulated exploitation became the preferred solution for rulers seeking to build religiously homogeneous national identities. The persecution and eventual annihilation of the Jewish communities in the Duchy of Austria in 1421, an event known in Jewish historiography as the Wiener Gesetze, was a meticulously planned state action driven by a confluence of ducal debt, political ambition, and religious fervor. Under the rule of Duke Albert V of Habsburg, the Jewish population had initially enjoyed a degree of protection, primarily because they served as a crucial source of credit for the perennially indebted ducal court. However, this financial dependence fostered resentment and created a powerful incentive for the Duke to find a permanent solution to his fiscal obligations. The context for this action was the outbreak of the Hussite Wars in neighbouring Bohemia. Albert V, eager to position himself as a staunch defender of Catholic orthodoxy and a key player in the anti-Hussite coalition, found that a campaign against his Jewish subjects served his political and religious goals perfectly. The pretext for the persecution emerged in 1420 with an accusation of host desecration in the town of Enns. This charge, combined with fabricated claims that Austrian Jews were secretly supplying weapons and funds to the Hussite rebels, provided the ideological justification for a swift and comprehensive crackdown. In the spring of 1420, Duke Albert ordered the arrest of every Jew within his domains, from Vienna to the outlying towns. Their assets were immediately seized, their homes inventoried, and their financial records confiscated by ducal officials. The primary objective was the systematic expropriation of the community's wealth. The wealthiest individuals were subjected to intense torture to force them to reveal the location of any hidden money or valuables. The period of imprisonment was marked by intense pressure to convert to Christianity. Official records document the forced baptism of hundreds, while children were systematically separated from their parents and placed in monasteries to be raised as Christians. For those who resisted, the outcome was grim. The persecution reached its climax on March 12, 1421. On a field in the Viennese suburb of Erdberg, more than 200 of the remaining Jewish men and women who had steadfastly refused to abandon their faith were publicly burned at the stake. On the same day, a final edict was issued, formally expelling all remaining Jews from the Duchy of Austria. To complete the act of erasure, the main synagogue in Vienna was demolished, and its stones were repurposed for the construction of a new building for the University of Vienna, a physical and symbolic testament to the complete destruction of a once thriving community. In the mid-15th century, the landscape of Central Europe was fertile ground for religious extremism, shaped by the recent Hussite Wars and the growing threat of Ottoman expansion. Into this volatile environment stepped the Franciscan friar John of Capistrano, a papal inquisitor and charismatic preacher, whose travels left a trail of persecution and expulsion. Known as the Scourge of the Jews, Capistrano harnessed his considerable oratorical skill and papal authority to transform latent anti-Jewish sentiment into organized, violent action. His sermons, delivered in the vernacular to massive open-air crowds, were a potent mixture of religious zeal, social grievance, and incendiary accusations. He systematically demonized Jewish communities, accusing them of rampant usury that impoverished Christians, blasphemy against the faith, and, most damningly, of being secret allies to the Ottoman Turks. Capistrano's arrival in a city often acted as the direct catalyst for persecution. His methodology was consistent. His fiery preaching would inflame the local populace and pressure the municipal authorities to act. The most notorious instance of his influence occurred in Breslau, Silesia, in 1453. Following a local accusation of host desecration, Capistrano was invited to the city to oversee the investigation. He turned the process into a public spectacle, presiding over a trial where confessions were extracted from Jewish leaders under extreme torture. The proceedings culminated in the public burning of 41 Jews at the stake. Immediately following this mass execution, the city council, under immense pressure from the friar and the incited mob, decreed the permanent expulsion of the entire remaining Jewish population from Breslau. All Jewish property was confiscated, and their children were forcibly baptized. This pattern was repeated, albeit with local variations, across numerous territories. In Bavaria, his sermons led to the expulsion of Jews from several towns. In Franconia, his presence intensified existing tensions, resulting in new legal restrictions and outbreaks of violence. His travels through Poland and Moravia similarly corresponded with a marked increase in anti-Jewish agitation. John of Capistrano's career represents a critical development in the history of European anti-Semitism. The transition from localized, spontaneous outbursts of violence to systematically incited persecution, legitimized by the authority of the Church, and expertly manipulated by a single, powerful religious figure to achieve the goal of a Jew-free Christendom. Unlike the definitive centralized expulsions from England and France, the Jewish experience within the Holy Roman Empire during the 15th and 16th centuries was defined by a bewildering patchwork of local edicts. The empire's fragmented political structure, with hundreds of semi-autonomous free imperial cities, territorial principalities, and ecclesiastical domains, meant that there was no single, overarching policy. Instead, the fate of a Jewish community rested on the specific economic and political calculations of the local city council or ruling prince. This decentralization created a state of perpetual instability, a continuous and exhausting cycle of expulsion and resettlement. The primary driver of this cycle was overwhelmingly economic. City councils, often heavily indebted to Jewish financiers and facing pressure from Christian guilds who resented competition, found expulsion to be a politically and fiscally expedient tool. A typical pattern emerged across the German-speaking lands. A city, such as Ulm in 1499 or Nuremberg in the same year, would decree the expulsion of its Jewish community. This act served multiple purposes simultaneously. It appeased the guilds and the clergy. It allowed the municipality to cancel its outstanding debts owed to Jewish lenders, and it enabled the seizure of Jewish property, including homes, synagogues, and cemeteries. The emperor, who technically held the right of protection over the Jews in exchange for significant taxes, was often too weak or too politically compromised to intervene effectively against the will of a powerful imperial city. For a period, the city would function without its Jewish population, its debts cleared, and its assets absorbed. However, the economic void created by the expulsion often became detrimental. The absence of Jewish merchants and moneylenders could disrupt regional trade and create a credit crisis that hampered the city's own economy. Recognizing this, the same city councils that had expelled the Jews would, after a decade or a generation, enter into negotiations to invite them back. This resettlement was never a restoration of previous rights. The returning community would be subjected to far stricter regulations, heavier taxes, and more precarious legal statuses. They were recalled not out of tolerance, but as a necessary economic utility. This process could repeat itself multiple times, as seen in cities like Augsburg, creating a nomadic existence for communities who were forced to move from one territory to another, their presence tolerated only as long as it remained profitable for their temporary hosts. The establishment of the Tribunal of the Holy Office of the Inquisition in the Crown of Castile in 1478, sanctioned by Pope Sixtus IV at the request of the Catholic monarchs Ferdinand and Isabella, represented a fundamental turning point in the Iberian Peninsula's approach to religious diversity. Unlike the earlier papal-controlled medieval inquisitions, this new institution was an instrument of the Spanish crown, designed to achieve political unification through absolute religious uniformity. Its primary and explicit target was not the practicing Jewish population, but rather the large and influential community of conversos, or new Christians, those who had converted from Judaism to Catholicism. These conversions had occurred over several generations, often under extreme duress, especially following the widespread and violent pogroms of 1391. Many old Christians viewed the conversos, who were often economically successful and integrated into the professions and royal administration, with a mixture of envy and deep suspicion, believing them to be insincere in their faith and secret practitioners of Jewish rites, a practice known as crypto-Judaism. The Inquisition operated as a powerful and terrifying bureaucratic machine. It functioned outside the bounds of common law, relying on secret denunciations from anonymous accusers. The accused had no right to legal counsel, were not informed of the specific charges against them, and were presumed guilty until proven innocent, an almost impossible task. To secure confessions, inquisitors were authorized to use systematic torture, employing methods such as the strapado, suspension by the wrists, and the toca, water torture. The proceedings were meticulously documented by scribes, creating a vast archive of coerced testimony that implicated ever wider networks of family and associates. The culmination of an inquisitorial trial was the auto de fe, a public ceremony of penance where the sentences were read aloud. These events were massive public spectacles designed to instill fear and demonstrate the absolute power of the church and crown. Punishments ranged from fines and public humiliation to long prison sentences. Those convicted of heresy who refused to recant, or who were judged to have relapsed, were relaxed to the secular arm, a euphemism for being handed over to the state authorities for public execution, most often by being burned at the stake. Through its relentless persecution of the conversos, the Inquisition constructed the ideological framework for the next logical step. Inquisitors, led by the infamous Tomás de Torquemada, argued that the new Christians could never be fully purified as long as a practicing Jewish community existed to influence them. The tribunal thus created a manufactured crisis, a prelude to the mass expulsion that would aim to solve the very problem it had defined. On January 2, 1492, the final Muslim stronghold in the Iberian Peninsula, the Emirate of Granada, surrendered to the forces of Ferdinand and Isabella. This event marked the completion of the centuries-long Reconquista and the consolidation of a unified Catholic Spanish monarchy. With the external enemy vanquished, the monarchs turned their attention inward to the project of absolute religious homogeneity. Less than 3 months later, on March 31, 1492, from the newly conquered Alhambra Palace, they signed the edict that would bring an end to more than a millennium of Jewish life in Spain. The Alhambra decree was not a call for conversion but an ultimatum of expulsion. It gave the entire practicing Jewish population of Castile and Aragon a stark choice: accept baptism and become new Christians, or leave the kingdom permanently by the last day of July. The official justification presented in the edict was a direct extension of the Inquisition's logic. It claimed that the continued presence of practicing Jews provided a constant temptation and source of support for conversos wishing to relapse into crypto-Judaism. The decree argued that all lesser measures such as segregating Jews into ghettos and limiting their economic activities had failed to protect the Catholic faith. Therefore, the only remaining solution was the complete removal of the offending community. This rationale, heavily promoted by Grand Inquisitor Tomás de Torquemada, effectively blamed the Jewish population for the very problem the Inquisition was created to solve. The edict was an act of state-sponsored religious purification, aiming to create a monolithic Catholic society under the absolute authority of the Crown. The 4-month deadline created an immediate and catastrophic crisis for Spain's Jewish communities. They were forced to liquidate centuries of accumulated property and assets in an impossibly short time. The decree explicitly forbade them from taking gold, silver, coined money, or horses out of the kingdom. This forced them into a buyer's market where their homes, businesses, and lands were sold for a fraction of their actual worth, often in exchange for bills of exchange that were difficult to redeem abroad. The exodus that summer was a massive logistical and human tragedy. Estimates of the number of exiles vary widely, but modern scholarship suggests between 40 and 100 people departed. They left by sea and land, heading for Portugal, the Ottoman Empire, North Africa, and Italy. This single royal edict dismantled one of the world's most ancient and intellectually vibrant Jewish centers, scattering the Sephardic diaspora across the Mediterranean and fundamentally altering the demographic and cultural map of the Jewish world. The deadline of July 31, 1492, triggered a mass displacement unprecedented in scale and desperation. The initial destinations for the Spanish exiles were dictated by geography and expediency, leading to perilous journeys fraught with exploitation. Many sought refuge in neighbouring Portugal, paying exorbitant fees to King John II for temporary asylum, only to find themselves trapped. In 1497, his successor, King Manuel I, seeking a marriage alliance with Spain, decreed the forced conversion of all Jews within his borders, including the thousands of Spanish refugees. Children were seized from their parents to compel baptism, creating a vast new population of nominal Christians, and ensuring that for many, the flight from Spain was merely a prelude to another form of persecution. Others undertook hazardous sea voyages to the kingdoms of North Africa, where they faced attacks by pirates and extortionate ship captains who often robbed them and abandoned them on desolate shores. A more welcoming, and ultimately more significant, destination was the Ottoman Empire. Sultan Bayezid II, recognizing the immense human capital being expelled from Spain, issued a formal invitation to the Sephardic Jews, reportedly chiding the Spanish monarchs for impoverishing their own kingdom to enrich his. Ottoman ships were even dispatched to help transport refugees. This policy led to the establishment of major new centers of Jewish life across the empire. Cities like Constantinople, Adrianople, and especially Salonika in Greece were transformed by the influx of Sephardic exiles. These new arrivals brought with them invaluable skills in diplomacy, medicine, international trade, and, crucially, the printing press. They established the first presses in the Ottoman lands, printing works in Hebrew, Ladino, and other languages, which fueled a cultural and intellectual renaissance. Smaller but influential communities formed in the Italian city-states. Ferrara, under the Este Dukes, and the port of Livorno in Tuscany offered relative tolerance and commercial opportunities. In Venice, the authorities received the exiles, but in 1516, formally segregated them into a fortified area, the Ghetto Nuovo, a model of containment that would be replicated across Europe. Over the subsequent decades, a clandestine migration also took place. Many conversos who remained in Iberia, living under the constant shadow of the Inquisition, used their commercial networks to escape to the Spanish and Portuguese colonies in the New World. In places like Brazil, Mexico, and Peru, they sought to rebuild their lives and, in the secrecy of their new homes, practice their ancestral faith far from the reach of the Holy Office. The Spanish edict thus forged a new global Sephardic diaspora, a network of communities scattered across the Mediterranean and the Atlantic, bound by a shared tragic memory and a resilient cultural identity. The Jewish experience in Portugal took a catastrophic turn due to dynastic politics. King Manuel I, in his bid to marry Isabella of Aragon, daughter of Spain's Catholic monarchs, was faced with a non-negotiable condition: the expulsion of all Jews from his kingdom to complete the religious purification of the Iberian Peninsula. Initially reluctant to lose a population vital to Portugal's economy and administration, a community swelled by tens of thousands of skilled Spanish refugees, Manuel issued an edict in December 1496. It gave all Jews until October 1497 to leave. However, the king's true intention was not expulsion but mass conversion by coercion, a strategy designed to retain the population and their assets while still satisfying the terms of his marriage contract. His policy quickly diverged from the Spanish model into a uniquely brutal state-managed operation. To prevent the mass departure he had officially commanded, Manuel I, an act of profound cruelty in the spring of 1497. He ordered that all Jewish children between the ages of 4 and 14 be seized from their families, forcibly baptized, and raised as Christians in homes across the country. This measure was a calculated act of psychological warfare, intended to break the will of the parents and compel them to convert to be reunited with their children. With the deadline for departure approaching, the king then commanded all remaining Jews to assemble at the port of Lisbon, under the pretense of providing them with ships for their exile. Thousands complied, only to find themselves herded into the confines of the Ozestaus palace and trapped. The promised fleet never arrived. Instead of passage out of Portugal, the assembled multitudes were subjected to a state-orchestrated ritual of mass forced conversion. Priests moved through the desperate crowds, sprinkling them with holy water and declaring them, against their will, to be Christians. There was no individual choice, no theological instruction, only a unilateral declaration by the state. This single event instantly created a new, enormous class of new Christians, or Cristãos Novos. Unlike in Spain, there was no large-scale exodus. Instead, the Portuguese Jewish community was driven underground, giving rise to a deeply entrenched tradition of crypto-Judaism. King Manuel, having achieved his political objective, initially promised the new Christians a grace period of 20 years without inquisitorial investigation into their private faith, a fragile guarantee that only delayed the inevitable establishment of the Portuguese Inquisition and decades of sustained persecution. The mass forced conversions in Spain and Portugal did not extinguish Jewish identity, but instead drove it into a clandestine existence, creating a unique and enduring phenomenon known as crypto-Judaism. The new Christians, officially termed conversos in Spain and Cristãos Novos in Portugal, were publicly Catholic, yet a significant number continued to practice Jewish rites in secret. Derisively labelled marinos, a term meaning swine, by old Christians, these individuals and their descendants embarked on a centuries-long struggle to preserve their ancestral faith under the constant threat of discovery. This secret life demanded an elaborate system of concealment, transforming the home into a hidden sanctuary and vesting women as managers of the domestic sphere with the primary responsibility for transmitting tradition. Preservation of Jewish law was fragmented and adapted for survival. The Sabbath would be honored not by open rest, but by subtle acts. Families might light candles in a cellar, change into fresh clothes on Friday evening, or prepare special meals in advance. Dietary laws were particularly perilous to maintain. A refusal to eat pork, a staple of Iberian cuisine, was a common cause for suspicion. Crypto-Jewish families developed strategies to circumvent this, such as rendering pork fat to cook with, giving the appearance of conformity, or feigning illness to avoid non-kosher foods at public gatherings. Major holidays were observed through modified rituals. Passover was marked by secretly baking unleavened bread, or matzah, and holding a seder that stripped away any conspicuous Hebrew elements. Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, was often observed by fasting under the guise of sickness. Religious knowledge was passed down orally, often from mother to daughter, resulting in the preservation of prayers, blessings, and biblical stories in altered, sometimes barely recognizable forms. Without access to rabbinic authorities or Hebrew texts, which were impossible to own safely, their Judaism became a deeply personal and familial tradition, heavily reliant on memory and domestic ritual. This clandestine existence was lived under the perpetual gaze of the Inquisition. The Holy Office actively trained the populace to watch for signs of Judaizing, and a network of informants, including neighbors and disgruntled servants, made denunciation a constant danger. The slightest misstep, a murmured prayer, the avoidance of a certain food, the appearance of mourning on a Saturday could lead to arrest, torture, and the auto da fe. This legacy of hidden faith was one of extraordinary resilience, but it was sustained for generations at the cost of immense psychological strain and profound isolation. The Republic of Venice, a pragmatic maritime power driven by commerce, approached its Jewish population with a calculated tolerance starkly different from the expulsionist fervor of Iberia. Jews were economically essential, particularly as moneylenders, a practice forbidden to Christians, and as vital links in the Republic's lucrative trade with the Levant. Yet, their presence was a source of constant theological and social friction. This tension came to a head in the early 16th century. The aftermath of the devastating War of the League of Cambrai had left the Republic weakened and its mainland territories in disarray, driving an influx of refugees, including numerous Jews from the mainland, into the city of Venice itself. Their increased visibility intensified calls from religious leaders and populist factions for a definitive solution. On March 29, 1516, the Venetian Senate, after intense debate, arrived at a policy that was not expulsion but compulsory segregation. The decree mandated that all Jews residing in Venice must move to a designated quarter, a small island in the Cannaregio district known as the Ghetto Nuovo, or New Foundry, named for a copper foundry that had once occupied the site. The location was deliberately chosen for its isolation, surrounded by canals, making it easy to control and contain. This act represented the formalization of segregation, creating the first compulsory enclosed and guarded Jewish quarter in Europe. The very word ghetto derives from this specific Venetian location. The regulations governing life within this new space were strict and systematic. The area was enclosed by high walls, and its two access points were fitted with heavy gates. These gates were locked at sunset and reopened at dawn by Christian guards, whose salaries the Jewish residents were legally obligated to pay. During the day, Jews were permitted to leave to conduct business in the city, but they were required to wear a form of identification, initially a yellow circle sewn onto their clothing, later a distinctive yellow, and then red, hat to mark them as separate from the Christian population. Within the ghetto, as the population grew, the limited space forced residents to build vertically, creating some of the tallest residential buildings in the city, crammed together in a densely packed environment. The Venetian model offered a new paradigm for civic authorities across Europe, a method to retain the economic utility of Jewish communities while enforcing religious separation and social control. It was a template of containment that would be replicated in Rome, Florence, and many other cities, shaping the urban Jewish experience for the next 3 centuries. The religious and political upheaval of the Protestant Reformation triggered a militant and reactionary response from the Catholic Church, a period known as the Counter-Reformation. This new era of doctrinal rigidity found its champion in Pope Paul IV, formerly Cardinal Gian Pietro Carafa, who ascended to the papacy in 1555. A co-founder of the Roman Inquisition, Paul IV, was an ascetic and uncompromising figure, determined to purify the Church and enforce a strict theological order. His zealotry immediately targeted the Jewish communities of the Papal States, who had for centuries enjoyed a degree of protection and relative autonomy under the Renaissance popes. This era of comparative tolerance was shattered on July 14, 1555, with the promulgation of the papal bull Cum Nimis Absurdum. The bull's title, meaning "since it is absurd," laid out its theological premise. It was intolerable that Jews, whom God had condemned to perpetual servitude for their guilt in the crucifixion, should be allowed to live freely among Christians. It was a systematic reversal of previous papal policy, designed to enforce total segregation and economic ruin. The decree's provisions were swift and devastating. It mandated that all Jews in Rome and other cities of the Papal States be confined to a single designated quarter, which was to be walled and gated. The Roman ghetto was established immediately, its gates locked at night to imprison the inhabitants. Economically, the bull was crippling. It forbade Jews from owning any real estate, forcing them into a mass sell-off of their properties to Christians at fractions of their value. Their commercial activities were severely curtailed. They were stripped of their roles in banking and trade, and legally restricted to the single occupation of dealing in second-hand clothing and rags. The bull further prohibited them from employing Christian servants, nurses, or laborers, severing long-standing economic relationships. Socially, it enforced a policy of visible degradation. All Jewish men were compelled to wear a distinctive yellow hat, and women a yellow veil, marking them for public identification. They were restricted to a single synagogue per city, forcing the closure of many long-established places of worship. The decree was not an edict of expulsion from the territory, but an act of internal exile, creating a permanent, impoverished, and humiliated captive population that would remain locked within ghetto walls for more than 300 years. In the mid-17th century, the vast Ukrainian territories of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth were a volatile frontier society, structured by a rigid feudal system. The Polish Catholic nobility, the szlachta, owned immense agricultural estates populated by an enserfed Orthodox Christian peasantry. To manage these holdings, the nobility relied heavily on a class of Jewish administrators, tax collectors, and leaseholders known as arrendators. This arrangement placed the Jewish population in a precarious and visible intermediary role, making them the direct enforcers of the economic policies that exploited the Ukrainian peasants. They were perceived not merely as religious outsiders, but as the tangible agents of Polish oppression, collecting rents, tolls, and taxes on behalf of absentee landlords. This simmering resentment erupted in 1648, with the start of the Khmelnytsky Uprising, a massive Cossack rebellion led by the hetman Bohdan Khmelnytsky. The revolt was fueled by a potent combination of grievances: the erosion of Cossack autonomy, the social and economic burdens placed on the peasantry, and the religious domination of the Orthodox population by the Catholic Polish state. While the primary targets were the Polish nobility and clergy, the Jewish communities, inextricably linked in the popular imagination with the Polish regime, became victims of a furious and systematic wave of violence. The ensuing massacres were not merely a byproduct of the war, but a central feature of the uprising. From the spring of 1648, Cossack armies, joined by peasant mobs, swept through the towns and shtetls of modern-day Ukraine. The violence that followed was of a scale unprecedented in Ashkenazi history. Entire communities were annihilated. In Nemirov, the Cossacks gained entry by pretending to be Polish allies, then proceeded to slaughter the town's Jewish inhabitants. In Tulchin, thousands who had sought refuge in a fortified manor were massacred after being promised safe passage. The chronicles of the era, such as Nathan of Hanover's Yevon Metzula, document acts of extreme brutality, with tens of thousands killed across the region. The event, known in Jewish history as Gezerot Tachvivtat, the decrees of the years 5408-5409, utterly devastated the demographic and economic heartland of Eastern European Jewry. It shattered hundreds of communities, created a massive wave of refugees fleeing west, and left a permanent scar on the collective memory of the Jewish people, signaling the violent end to a long period of relative security in the Commonwealth. Following the 30 Years' War, the Habsburg capital of Vienna was a city undergoing significant political and religious consolidation. Its Jewish community, having been expelled and readmitted multiple times in previous centuries, existed in a state of protected but precarious tolerance. They were largely confined to a district on a Danube island known as the Unterer Word, where they had developed a thriving economic and cultural life, serving the imperial court and military as financiers and suppliers. This utility, however, offered no permanent security against the forces of counter-Reformation piety and economic jealousy that characterized the reign of Emperor Leopold I. The emperor, a devout Catholic, was heavily influenced by his Spanish wife, Margarita Teresa, and a circle of ardently anti-Jewish advisors, most notably Bishop Leopold Karl von Kolonitsch. A confluence of pressures began to mount against the community in the late 1660s. Christian merchants and guilds, resentful of Jewish commercial success, launched a concerted campaign of petitions and lobbying, demanding the removal of their economic competitors. This was amplified by religious propaganda that blamed the presence of Jews for various misfortunes, including a fire in the Hofburg Palace and the empress's failure to produce a male heir. These pretexts provided the emperor with the justification needed to act. In 1669, Leopold I issued an edict ordering the expulsion of all Jews from the city of Vienna, a decree that was extended the following year to encompass all of Lower Austria. The expulsion was carried out with bureaucratic precision. The approximately 3,000 Jews of Vienna were given a deadline to liquidate their assets and depart. Their properties, including homes and businesses, were sold at drastically reduced prices, and all communal assets were confiscated by the state. The main synagogue, a prominent structure in the Unterer Word, was seized and ceremonially converted into a Catholic church, rededicated as the Leopoldskirche. The expulsion was completed by the summer of 1670. In a symbolic act of erasure, the former Jewish district was renamed Leopoldstadt, Leopold City, in the emperor's honor. The displaced community scattered, with many finding refuge in Moravia, Bohemia, and Brandenburg, while others journeyed as far as the Ottoman Empire. The act represented a definitive statement of Habsburg religious policy, demonstrating that even a well-established and economically vital Jewish community could be dismantled by the will of an absolutist monarch, swayed by religious and political pressures. In the 18th century, the Jewish community of Prague stood as one of the oldest and most significant in Europe, a center of commerce and Talmudic scholarship within the Habsburg Kingdom of Bohemia. Their long-established presence, however, offered no immunity from the political tempests of the era. The War of the Austrian Succession, which erupted in 1740, directly challenged the authority of the young Empress Maria Theresa. In 1741, a Franco-Bavarian army occupied Prague, followed by a Prussian occupation the next year. When Habsburg forces eventually recaptured the city, the Jewish community was accused of collaboration and disloyalty, charged with having aided the occupying armies. These accusations, though largely unsubstantiated and likely fueled by the community's need to negotiate for its survival under foreign rule, provided a convenient pretext for the empress. Maria Theresa, a monarch known for her devout Catholicism and personal antipathy towards Jews, harbored a deep-seated desire to reduce their presence in her domains. On December 18, 1744, she issued a royal patent decreeing the expulsion of all Jews from Prague by the end of January 1745, and from the entirety of Bohemia and Moravia by the end of June. The order affected tens of thousands of individuals, commanding the complete uprooting of a community that had existed in the region for centuries. The expulsion from Prague was executed during the severe winter of 1745, causing immense suffering and dislocation, as thousands were forced from their homes with little time to prepare. The economic repercussions for the kingdom were immediate and catastrophic. The Jewish population was integral to Bohemia's commerce, industry, and tax base. Their sudden removal crippled trade, disrupted supply chains, and created a vacuum in the financial sector. Christian merchants, guilds, and even members of the nobility who had initially supported the expulsion soon found their own economic interests severely damaged. A powerful coalition of municipal authorities and business leaders began to petition the empress, highlighting the economic ruin her decree had caused. International pressure also mounted, with diplomats from Great Britain and the Dutch Republic lodging formal protests on behalf of their nation's commercial interests. Faced with a collapsing Bohemian economy and sustained diplomatic intervention, Maria Theresa finally relented. In 1748, she rescinded the expulsion order, but her permission to return came at a steep price. The community was subjected to a punitive and exorbitant annual levy known as the Toleranzgeld, or toleration tax, institutionalizing their status as a tolerated but fundamentally unwelcome minority, whose existence was contingent upon their financial utility to the crown. In the latter half of the 18th century, The Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, while politically decaying, remained the demographic and cultural heartland of Ashkenazi Jewry. This vast, multi-ethnic state was home to the largest Jewish population in the world, a community that had developed a unique system of corporate autonomy through the Kahal, a network of local and regional self-governing councils. This semi-independent status was shattered by the geopolitical ambitions of its neighbours. Through a series of 3 partitions in 1772, 1793, and 1795, the Commonwealth was systematically dismantled, and its territories absorbed by the Russian Empire, the Kingdom of Prussia, and the Habsburg monarchy. Russia, the primary beneficiary, suddenly found itself the ruler of an unprecedentedly large and cohesive Jewish population, for which its autocratic and Orthodox Christian state structure had no precedent. This abrupt inheritance created what became known as the Jewish question for the Tsarist administration. Unwilling to integrate this non-Christian Yiddish-speaking population into the Russian interior, and fearful of their economic influence on the Russian merchant class, the government of Catherine the Great sought a policy of containment. The solution was codified through a series of imperial decrees, beginning with the ukase of 1791, which established the Cherta Osiedlosti, or the Pale of Settlement. This was not an expulsion in the traditional sense of removing a population from the state's borders, but rather a monumental act of internal confinement. The Pale designated a vast territory in the western borderlands of the empire, encompassing most of modern-day Lithuania, Belarus, Ukraine, and parts of Poland, as the only region where the vast majority of Russian Jews were legally permitted permanent residence. Movement into the Russian heartland, particularly to major cities like Moscow and St. Petersburg, was strictly forbidden, with few exceptions for certain merchants, artisans, and university graduates. The policy effectively transformed the former territories of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth into a massive, legally circumscribed reservation. This act of administrative segregation trapped millions of Jews within a specific geographic zone, leading to severe economic strain, overcrowding, and endemic poverty. The creation of the Pale of Settlement fundamentally redefined the relationship between the state and its Jewish subjects, institutionalizing a system of geographic and economic restriction that would shape the destiny of Russian Jewry for over a century and serve as the backdrop for future waves of persecution. The intellectual currents of the 18th century Enlightenment, with their emphasis on reason, natural law, and universal human rights, began to systematically erode the theological and corporate foundations of the Ancien Régime. This philosophical shift inevitably forced a re-evaluation of the status of Europe's Jewish populations, who existed as a distinct legal and social entity outside the traditional Christian estates. The debate over Jewish emancipation was not initially driven by philo-Semitism, but by the logic of the nascent modern state, which sought to rationalize society and make all its subjects productive and uniform citizens. Thinkers across the continent grappled with the problem of how, or if, this distinct group could be integrated. In Germany, the discussion was framed by figures like Christian Wilhelm von Dohm, whose 1781 treatise on the civic improvement of the Jews argued that the perceived negative characteristics of Jewish society were a direct result of centuries of oppressive legislation. He proposed a gradual extension of rights, conditional upon the regeneration of the Jews into useful subjects. This concept of conditional emancipation was echoed within the Jewish community itself through the Haskalah, or Jewish Enlightenment, championed by Moses Mendelssohn. He advocated for Jews to adopt secular education and the vernacular language of their host countries, arguing for a synthesis of modern European culture and private Jewish faith. The first significant, albeit limited, state action came from the Habsburg Empire. Emperor Joseph II's Edict of Toleration of 1782 was a pragmatic measure designed to enhance the utility of his Jewish subjects. It abolished the requirement to wear a distinctive badge, opened secular schools and universities to Jews, and permitted them to enter a wider range of trades, but maintained significant restrictions on residency and communal autonomy. The true watershed moment, however, was the French Revolution. The 1789 Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen, proclaiming that all men are born and remain free and equal in rights, made the continued exclusion of Jews a logical inconsistency. The debate in the National Assembly was fierce, crystallizing the central tension of emancipation in the famous formulation of Count Stanislas de Clermont-Tonnerre: to the Jews as a nation, nothing; to the Jews as individuals, everything. The underlying premise was that in exchange for full civil rights, Jews must renounce their communal autonomy and distinct legal identity. On September 27, 1791, the Assembly voted to grant full and equal citizenship to all Jews of France, the first time this had occurred in modern European history. This act, later extended across the continent by the Napoleonic conquests, established the definitive model for emancipation, a contract in which individual rights were granted in exchange for the dissolution of collective Jewish identity and complete loyalty to the secular nation-state. The legal emancipation granted to Jews during the Napoleonic era proved to be a fragile foundation for their integration into German society. Following Napoleon's defeat, the Congress of Vienna in 1815 initiated a period of political restoration that saw many of these newfound rights rescinded or challenged across the German Confederation. This legal regression occurred within a climate of severe economic distress, marked by post-war financial instability, widespread unemployment, and the famine of 1816-17. It was in this volatile environment of political uncertainty and economic hardship that the first widespread and violent backlash against Jewish integration erupted. The riots began in Würzburg, Bavaria, on August 2, 1819, catalyzed by a university professor who called for action against the local Jewish population. The academic agitation quickly spilled into the streets, where artisans, merchants, and students formed mobs, adopting the enigmatic and menacing cry, "Hep, hep, Jude Verrick. Hep, hep, Jew drop dead." This outburst was not an isolated incident. From Würzburg, the violence spread with remarkable speed throughout the German states, igniting similar riots in Bamberg, Karlsruhe, Mannheim, Frankfurt, and Hamburg, and extending as far as Copenhagen in Denmark. The pattern of the violence was consistent. The primary targets were Jewish businesses and homes. Mobs engaged in systematic looting and the destruction of property, smashing windows, ransacking shops, and vandalizing synagogues. While the number of fatalities was limited, the riots were a campaign of mass terror designed to intimidate Jewish communities and physically drive them from the cities. In many instances, the civil authorities and militia forces were slow to intervene, their response often reflecting an underlying sympathy with the rioters' grievances, which were rooted in economic anxieties and a nascent form of German nationalism that defined the state in exclusively Christian terms. The Hep Hep riots represented a profound turning point. They were the first major pogrom in Western Europe in the post-Enlightenment era, and shattered the optimistic belief that legal equality would lead to social acceptance. The violence exposed a new, modern form of anti-Jewish sentiment, one less concerned with theological disputes and more animated by economic resentment and nationalist exclusion. For the Jewish communities, particularly those who had embraced the ideals of the Haskalah and sought integration, the riots were a traumatic disillusionment. The events demonstrated that emancipation was not an irreversible process, but a precarious status subject to the whims of popular animosity and political expediency, revealing the deep and violent currents of opposition that lay just beneath the surface of the German Confederation's restored order. In February of 1840, the medieval European accusation of ritual murder was revived with devastating consequences in the Ottoman city of Damascus. The disappearance of a Capuchin friar, Father Thomas, and his Muslim servant, Ibrahim Amara, became the catalyst for a full-scale assault on the city's Jewish community. Driven by the local Christian populace and aggressively supported by the French consul Ulysse de Rati-Menton, the governor of Damascus, Sheriff Pasha, initiated an investigation predicated on the blood libel. Prominent members of the Jewish community, including merchants and rabbis, were arrested and subjected to systematic torture to extract confessions. The barber Solomon Negrin, under extreme duress, implicated other leading Jewish figures in a fictitious plot to murder the friar for his blood to be used in the making of Passover matzah. Based on these coerced testimonies, the authorities arrested more community members and sealed off the Jewish quarter. The investigation escalated into a campaign of terror. 63 Jewish children were taken hostage to pressure their parents into confessing, and synagogues were desecrated in a search for the victims' remains. The affair quickly transcended the boundaries of a local persecution, becoming a major international incident that exposed the vulnerabilities of non-Muslim communities to the interplay of local prejudice and European consular power. News of the atrocities reached Western Europe, galvanizing the newly emancipated and politically conscious Jewish communities into action. This crisis prompted an unprecedented international Jewish response. A delegation led by the British philanthropist Sir Moses Montefiore and the French lawyer Adolphe Crémieux was formed to intervene directly. Their efforts were bolstered by diplomatic pressure from other Western powers. The British Foreign Secretary, Lord Palmerston, condemned the proceedings, as did the Austrian government and the American consul in Alexandria. This diplomatic coalition stood in stark contrast to the French government, which, seeking to expand its influence in the Levant, publicly supported its consul in Damascus. The delegation travelled to Alexandria to appeal directly to Muhammad Ali Pasha of Egypt, who held de facto control over Syria. Faced with intense international pressure and presented with evidence of the use of torture, Muhammad Ali ordered the unconditional release of the 9 surviving prisoners in August 1840. Subsequently, Montefiore travelled to Constantinople and secured a landmark firman, or imperial edict, from the Ottoman Sultan Abdülmecid I, which formally denounced the blood libel and affirmed the legal rights and protections of Jewish subjects throughout the empire. The Damascus affair was a watershed moment, marking the first successful instance of international Jewish diplomacy and solidarity in the modern era. Under the autocratic rule of Tsar Nicholas I, the Russian Empire implemented a policy of state-sponsored social engineering aimed at the Jewish population of the Pale of Settlement, a system unparalleled in its design and cruelty. The Statute on Conscription Duty of 1827 extended the military draft to the Jews, but with uniquely punitive conditions. This legislation created the institution of the Cantonists, a system of forced conscription for Jewish boys intended to serve the dual imperial goals of military recruitment and forced assimilation. While the standard draft age for non-Jews was 18, the decree mandated that Jewish communities meet a disproportionately high quota of recruits, including boys as young as 12 who were to be placed in preparatory military institutions, or cantons. In practice, the age was often much lower, with children of 8 or 9 being seized. This policy placed an unbearable burden on the Jewish communal leadership, the Kahal, which was made legally responsible for delivering the required number of children to the authorities. This state-enforced obligation created deep and traumatic fissures within the communities. To meet the relentless quotas, the Kahal often employed capers, snatchers, or kidnappers who would forcibly take boys, typically from the poorest and least protected families, to fulfill the state's demands. The process of induction was brutal. The children were torn from their homes and marched for weeks or months to Cantonist schools located in distant provinces like Kazan and Siberia, far from any Jewish life. The explicit purpose of these institutions was to erase their Jewish identity. The boys were subjected to a harsh regimen of military discipline, combined with intense psychological and physical pressure to convert to Russian Orthodoxy. Their names were changed, they were forbidden from practicing Jewish rituals, and they were systematically indoctrinated into a new faith and a new life. Those who resisted faced starvation, corporal punishment, and relentless coercion. After years in these preparatory schools, the survivors, now culturally and religiously alienated from their origins, would begin their official 25-year term of military service in the Imperial Russian Army. The Cantonist system, which remained in effect until its abolition by Tsar Alexander II in 1856, was not merely a military draft. It was a deliberate, long-term state policy designed to dismantle Jewish communal life and identity through the systematic removal and conversion of an entire generation of its youth. The assassination of Tsar Alexander II in March 1881 by revolutionaries of the Narodnaya Volya movement created a political firestorm that would be redirected with devastating force against the Jewish population of the Russian Empire. In the reactionary climate that followed, the presence of a single Jewish woman, Hesia Helfman, among the conspirators was exploited to propagate the false narrative that the Jews were collectively responsible for the Tsar liberator's death. This calumny served as the pretext for a wave of violent anti-Jewish riots, or pogroms, that erupted across the southern provinces of the Pale of Settlement. The violence began in Elisavetgrad in April 1881 and spread with calculated precision to over 200 Jewish communities, including major centers like Kiev, Odessa, and Warsaw. These were not spontaneous popular uprisings, but organized attacks, often conducted with the tacit approval or deliberate inaction of local authorities and police forces. The pattern of violence was systematic and brutal. Mobs composed of townspeople, peasants, and railway workers descended upon Jewish quarters, engaging in widespread looting, the destruction of homes and businesses, and the desecration of synagogues. The attacks were characterized by extreme physical violence, including beatings, rape, and murder, creating a campaign of terror that shattered the fragile sense of security that had begun to emerge during the previous reign. The passivity of the authorities signaled a fundamental shift in state policy, transforming the Jews into a scapegoat for Russia's internal political and economic turmoil. The new regime of Tsar Alexander III, heavily influenced by his conservative advisor Konstantin Pobedonostsev, viewed the pogroms not as a law and order crisis, but as a justifiable expression of popular Christian anger against perceived Jewish economic exploitation. Instead of prosecuting the perpetrators and protecting its Jewish subjects, the government responded with punitive legislation. In May 1882, the state enacted the temporary regulations, better known as the May Laws, which codified a new era of systematic discrimination. These laws severely restricted Jewish life, prohibiting Jews from settling in rural areas even within the Pale, limiting their rights to own or lease property, and placing severe constraints on their economic activities. The legislation effectively forced an already impoverished population into the overcrowded and economically stagnant cities and shtetls, intensifying their hardship and vulnerability. The pogroms of 1881, 1884, and the subsequent May Laws marked a catastrophic turning point. They extinguished the hopes for integration and emancipation, catalyzed the first great wave of mass Jewish emigration from Eastern Europe to the United States and Palestine, and gave birth to modern Jewish political movements, conceived in the understanding that a secure future within the Russian Empire was an impossibility. The government of Tsar Alexander III responded to the pogroms of 1881, not by restoring order or protecting its Jewish subjects, but by institutionalizing the very anti-Semitic ideology that had fueled the violence. In May 1882, under the guidance of the ardently anti-Jewish Minister of the Interior, Count Nikolai Ignatiev, the state enacted the temporary regulations concerning the Jews, a set of decrees that would become known as the May Laws. Far from being temporary, this legislation would remain in force for over 30 years, serving as the primary legal instrument for the economic strangulation and geographic containment of Russian Jewry. The laws were officially presented as a measure to protect the rural peasantry from alleged Jewish economic exploitation, thereby giving the state's imprimatur to the pogromists' central pretext. The core provisions of the May laws constituted a form of mass internal expulsion. The first and most devastating clause forbade Jews from settling anew in any rural village or hamlet, even within the confines of the Pale of Settlement. The second clause halted the execution of mortgages and leases in the names of Jews on properties outside the cities and shtetls, effectively barring them from owning or managing rural land. A third provision prohibited Jews from conducting business on Sundays and Christian holidays. This legislative package initiated a calamitous demographic shift, forcing hundreds of thousands of Jews who lived and worked in the countryside as artisans, innkeepers, and small-scale merchants to abandon their homes and livelihoods. This forced migration created an immediate and profound crisis. The already overcrowded towns and shtetls of the Pale were inundated with displaced families, intensifying poverty and straining communal resources to their breaking point. The economic consequences were catastrophic, severing the long-standing commercial relationships between Jews and the peasantry and eliminating entire sectors of the Jewish economy. The May laws were not a reactive measure, but a calculated policy of administrative coercion designed to make Jewish existence untenable. By legally entrenching segregation and systematically dismantling the economic foundations of rural Jewish life, the Russian state weaponized legislation to achieve what the pogroms had initiated through violence: the deliberate impoverishment and dislocation of an entire population, accelerating the mass exodus from the empire. In the final years of the 19th century, the French Third Republic, a nation that had pioneered Jewish emancipation over a century earlier, became the epicenter of a political crisis that exposed the profound vulnerability of that emancipation. The affair began in 1894 with the arrest of Captain Alfred Dreyfus, an Alsatian Jewish officer attached to the General Staff of the French Army, on charges of treason. The accusation centered on the discovery of a handwritten memorandum, the bordereau, detailing French military secrets, which had been recovered from a waste paper basket at the German embassy in Paris. Fueled by a pervasive anti-Semitic climate within the military high command and the nationalist press, investigators hastily attributed the handwriting to Dreyfus. His subsequent court-martial was conducted in secret, relying on a secret file of forged and irrelevant documents shown only to the judges, ensuring his conviction. In January 1895, Dreyfus was subjected to a public ceremony of degradation in the courtyard of the École Militaire, where his sword was broken and the insignia was stripped from his uniform before he was transported to a sentence of life imprisonment on Devil's Island. The case, however, did not close. Evidence soon emerged pointing to the true traitor, Major Ferdinand Wolsene Esterhazy, but the army command, committed to protecting its honor, engaged in a systematic cover-up, forging new evidence to further incriminate Dreyfus. The affair exploded into a national political scandal in 1898, with the publication of Émile Zola's open letter, J'accuse. On the front page of the newspaper L'Aurore, Zola's denunciation of the military establishment for deliberately framing an innocent man fractured French society into two bitterly opposed camps: the Dreyfusards, who championed republican justice and individual rights, and the anti-Dreyfusards, who defended the honor of the army and were animated by a virulent strain of modern, racialized anti-Semitism propagated by publications like Edouard Drumont's La Libre Parole. The Dreyfus affair transcended the fate of one man to become a battle over the fundamental principles of the French Republic. It demonstrated that legal equality was no guarantee against the eruption of political anti-Semitism, which had evolved from religious prejudice into a powerful nationalist ideology. After years of political turmoil, a retrial, and a presidential pardon, Dreyfus was finally exonerated in 1906. The ordeal revealed the deep-seated hostilities that persisted beneath the surface of supposedly assimilated Western European societies and served as a crucial catalyst for Theodor Herzl, who, having reported on the degradation ceremony, concluded that the only true security for the Jewish people lay in political sovereignty. In the spring of 1903, the city of Kishinev, the capital of the Bessarabia Governorate in the Russian Empire, became the site of an anti-Jewish riot of such calculated brutality that its name would become a global byword for pogrom. The violence was preceded by a systematic incitement campaign orchestrated by Pavel Krushevan, the publisher of the local anti-Semitic newspaper, Bessarabets. For weeks, the paper relentlessly propagated the medieval blood libel, falsely accusing the Jewish community of murdering a Christian boy in the nearby town of Dubasari for ritual purposes, despite official reports that the boy had been killed by a relative. This inflammatory propaganda, combined with official encouragement from provincial authorities, created an explosive atmosphere, timed to detonate during the Orthodox Easter celebrations. The pogrom erupted on April 6, 1903, and continued for 3 days. It was not a spontaneous outburst of popular anger, but a well-organized massacre. Mobs, reportedly led by seminary students, moved through the Jewish quarters with lists of addresses, systematically targeting Jewish homes and businesses. The local police and military garrisons made no effort to intervene, creating an environment of state-sanctioned terror. The violence was characterized by extreme sadism and cruelty. 49 Jews were murdered, and over 500 were injured. The perpetrators engaged in systematic looting and the wholesale destruction of over 1,500 Jewish-owned houses and shops. Synagogues were desecrated, Torah scrolls were defiled, and the attacks were accompanied by widespread instances of rape and mutilation. What distinguished the Kishinev pogrom from previous waves of violence was the extensive international press coverage it received. Detailed reports of the atrocities, often accompanied by graphic photographs, were published in newspapers across Europe and the United States, provoking a wave of global condemnation. Mass protests were held in cities like New York, London, and Paris, and the United States government delivered a formal petition of protest to the Tsar. The event had a profound and lasting impact on the Jewish world. It shattered the hopes of many for a secure future in the Russian Empire and served as a powerful catalyst for mass emigration, significantly swelling the tide of Jewish migration to America. It also fueled the Zionist movement and spurred the formation of Jewish self-defense leagues, marking a turning point where the necessity of organized self-protection and political sovereignty became a central tenet of modern Jewish consciousness. The outbreak of World War I in 1914 transformed the western borderlands of the Russian Empire into a vast and brutal theatre of war. For the Jewish population concentrated in the Pale of Settlement, the conflict brought not only the generalized hardships of war, but also a new and systematic form of state-sponsored persecution. The Russian military high command, deeply imbued with a culture of anti-Semitism, viewed the entire Jewish populace as a politically unreliable element, a potential fifth column sympathetic to the Central Powers. This suspicion was fueled by the linguistic similarity between Yiddish and German, which military authorities cited as prima facie evidence of collaboration with the enemy. Beginning in the spring of 1915, as the Russian army retreated before the German and Austro-Hungarian offensive, the military leadership initiated a policy of mass deportations. Unlike the pogroms, which were often framed as spontaneous outbursts of popular fury, these were meticulously planned and ruthlessly executed military operations. Under the direct orders of figures like Grand Duke Nicholas Nikolaevich, the commander-in-chief, entire Jewish communities were declared a threat to national security. The expulsions were carried out with extreme haste and cruelty. Communities were given as little as 24 hours' notice to abandon their homes and all their possessions. Hundreds of thousands of Jews from the provinces of Kovno, Courland, and Grodno, as well as parts of Poland, were forcibly removed from their towns and shtetls. They were driven on foot in long columns, often under military guard, into the interior of Russia. These forced marches resulted in immense suffering and a high mortality rate from starvation, disease, and exposure. The scale of this internal displacement was staggering. Estimates suggest that between 500 and 600 Jews were expelled from the frontier zones during this period. This act of mass deportation created a catastrophic refugee crisis within the empire, overwhelming the resources of Jewish aid organizations and the communities in the interior tasked with absorbing the displaced. It represented a grim evolution in state policy, moving from legal restriction and sanctioned riots to the use of the military apparatus for the wholesale removal of a civilian population, based on collective suspicion of disloyalty. This wartime policy effectively dismantled the historic Jewish presence in many parts of the northwestern Pale, and served as a horrific precedent for the state-driven population transfers of the 20th century. The catastrophic defeat of Germany in World War I and the subsequent political turmoil of the Weimar Republic provided fertile ground for a radical ideological transformation in the nature of anti-Jewish hostility. The traditional religious anti-Judaism, which had defined persecution for centuries, gave way to a new and more pernicious form of hatred grounded in the language of pseudoscience and biology. This modern anti-Semitism reimagined Jews not as adherents of a different faith, who could theoretically cease to be other through conversion, but as members of an immutable and alien race whose fundamental characteristics were determined by blood. This shift was built upon the intellectual currents of the late 19th century, particularly the misappropriation of social Darwinism and the rise of eugenics, which posited a hierarchical struggle between human races. In Germany, these ideas were synthesized within the Völkisch movement, a potent strain of ethnic nationalism that idealized a mythical, pure-blooded German folk. Völkisch ideologues like Houston Stewart Chamberlain argued that history was a clash between a creative, noble Aryan race and a parasitic, degenerative Semitic race. For them, Jewishness was an unchangeable biological trait, an alien element that could never be assimilated into the German Volk. This racial framework provided a new vocabulary for old prejudices. The widespread economic hardship, national humiliation following the Treaty of Versailles, and political instability were not explained through political or economic analysis, but through conspiracy. The stab-in-the-back myth, or Dolchstoßlegende, became a central tenet of this ideology, falsely blaming Jewish politicians, socialists, and financiers for Germany's surrender. This narrative was powerfully reinforced by the global dissemination of the forged text, the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, which purported to be evidence of a Jewish plot for world domination. Political parties and paramilitary groups, most notably the nascent National Socialist German Workers' Party, adopted this racial ideology as their central organizing principle. They weaponized it, transforming complex societal problems into a singular struggle against a racial enemy. This ideological evolution was critical. By reframing the Jewish question as a biological problem rather than a religious or political one, it laid the intellectual groundwork for policies of segregation and exclusion that would eventually lead to the contemplation of a final solution. In the autumn of 1935, the Nazi regime moved to codify its racial ideology into the law of the land, transforming abstract hatred into a systematic framework for persecution. At the annual Nazi Party rally in Nuremberg, a city now synonymous with this legal turning point, two foundational pieces of legislation were unanimously passed by the Reichstag. These Nuremberg laws were not the beginning of anti-Jewish measures, but they marked the point at which the state formally and legally stripped German Jews of their citizenship and fundamental human rights, segregating them from the German nation. The first of these, the Reich Citizenship Law, established a stark distinction between a citizen of the Reich and a mere national. Full citizenship, with its attendant political rights, was now reserved exclusively for those of German or kindred blood who proved their loyalty to the Reich. This decree effectively relegated all German Jews overnight to the status of state subjects, devoid of political power and legal protection. The second piece of legislation, the Law for the Protection of German Blood and German Honor, was more invasive, targeting the most intimate aspects of life. It outlawed marriages between Jews and non-Jewish German citizens and criminalized extramarital relations between them under the charge of Rassenschande, or race defilement. To enforce this, the law also forbade Jewish households from employing female German domestic servants under the age of 45 and prohibited Jews from displaying the national flag. The legal definition of who was Jewish was clarified in a supplementary decree, which moved decisively away from religious practice to purely genealogical criteria. An individual was considered Jewish if they had 3 or 4 Jewish grandparents. Those with 1 or 2 Jewish grandparents were classified as Mischlinge, or mixed breeds, subject to a complex and often arbitrary set of restrictions. The immediate and cumulative effect of the Nuremberg laws was the systematic dismantling of the Jewish presence in German public life. They provided the legal architecture for the complete social ostracization and economic ruin of a segment of the population, creating a legally defined pariah class. This legislation was a critical step in the radicalization of Nazi policy. It institutionalized racial anti-Semitism and created the necessary legal precedent for all subsequent measures, including the confiscation of property, forced emigration, and the eventual deportations that would follow. The laws marked the definitive end of Jewish emancipation in Germany and the beginning of a state-organized campaign to remove Jews entirely from the life of the nation. The year 1938 witnessed a significant acceleration of the Nazi regime's anti-Jewish policies, moving from legislative exclusion to direct physical removal. This new phase was starkly demonstrated in the diplomatic and humanitarian crisis that unfolded in late October. The catalyst was a decree from the Polish government, which, concerned about a potential influx of impoverished Jewish refugees being pushed out of Germany, announced that the passports of Polish citizens residing abroad would require a special validation stamp by the end of the month to remain valid. This was a thinly veiled attempt to prevent tens of thousands of Polish Jews living in Germany from returning to their country of citizenship. The Nazi leadership, particularly Reinhard Heydrich, head of the security police, interpreted this move as an obstruction of their goal to make the Reich Judenrein, or free of Jews. In a swift and preemptive response, the German authorities orchestrated a mass deportation action known as the Polen Action. On the night of October 27th and into the 28th, Gestapo and police units across Germany began arresting thousands of Jews who held Polish citizenship. An estimated 17,000 people were rounded up with brutal efficiency, often given less than an hour to pack a single suitcase before being herded onto trains. They were stripped of their assets and transported to the German-Polish border. At the frontier, German guards forced them at gunpoint across the border into Poland. The Polish authorities, however, refused to admit them, creating a horrific stalemate. This action resulted in thousands of men, women, and children being stranded in a desolate no-man's land between the two hostile states. In the border town of Zabonchin, a humanitarian catastrophe ensued as nearly 8,000 refugees were forced into makeshift shelters in stables and warehouses, enduring freezing conditions with little food or medical care. The Polen Action was a grim logistical rehearsal for future, larger-scale deportations. It represented the first mass expulsion of Jews from the Third Reich and demonstrated the regime's capacity for coordinated, state-level violence against a targeted civilian population. The desperation of this event had immediate and tragic repercussions. Among the expelled were the parents of Herschel Grinspan, a young man living in Paris. His anguish over his family's fate would directly lead to his assassination of a German diplomat, an act that the Nazis would seize upon as the pretext for the state-sponsored violence of Kristallnacht just days later. The assassination of German diplomat Ernst von Rath in Paris by Herschel Grinspan, an act of desperation fueled by the expulsion of his parents during the Polen Action, provided the Nazi regime with the pretext it had sought to escalate its campaign against the Jews from legal and social pressure to overt, nationwide violence. On the evening of November 9th, 1938, as Nazi Party officials gathered in Munich to commemorate the anniversary of the beer hall putsch, propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels delivered a fiery, incendiary speech. Citing von Rath's death, he declared that the government would not quell any spontaneous demonstrations of the German people's wrath. This was a thinly veiled command for action, immediately understood by the assembled party functionaries. Instructions were rapidly disseminated to SA stormtroopers, Hitler Youth members, and other Nazi organizations across the Reich to unleash a coordinated assault on Jewish communities. What followed on the night of November 9th and into the 10th was not a spontaneous outburst of popular anger, but a meticulously organized, state-sponsored pogrom. Across Germany and Austria, the violence was systematic. Synagogues, the centers of Jewish religious and community life, were the primary targets. Official figures recorded that over 267 were set ablaze or completely destroyed, with firefighters under orders to only protect adjacent non-Jewish property. The streets were filled with the sound of shattering glass as the windows of an estimated 500 Jewish-owned businesses, department stores, and homes were smashed, giving the event its name, Kristallnacht, the Night of Broken Glass. Jewish hospitals, schools, and cemeteries were desecrated in a nationwide spectacle of public humiliation and destruction. The violence was not limited to property. At least 91 Jews were murdered in the attacks, and countless others were severely beaten. The pogrom was also a prelude to a new phase of mass incarceration. In the immediate aftermath, approximately 30 Jewish men were arrested for the crime of being Jewish, and were transported to concentration camps like Dachau, Buchenwald, and Sachsenhausen. This marked the first instance of mass arrests of Jews on such a scale, purely on racial grounds. The financial consequences were crushing. The German government cynically blamed the Jewish community for the destruction and imposed a collective fine of 1 billion Reichsmarks. Kristallnacht signaled a definitive and terrifying shift, demonstrating the regime's willingness to abandon legal pretense and employ open, brutal force, shattering any remaining hope for a secure Jewish future within the Reich. In the summer of 1938, as the persecution of Jews in Germany and newly annexed Austria intensified, the growing refugee crisis prompted United States President Franklin D. Roosevelt to call for an international conference. The stated purpose was to facilitate the emigration of political refugees from Germany and Austria. In July, delegates from 32 nations and representatives from dozens of refugee aid organizations convened in the French resort town of Évian-les-Bains. The conference was intended to be a demonstration of international humanitarian concern, yet its outcome would reveal a profound global indifference that had devastating consequences. From the outset, the proceedings were constrained by a critical limitation insisted upon by the United States. No country would be expected to alter its existing immigration laws or quotas to accommodate the refugees. Over the course of 9 days, a grim and repetitive pattern emerged. Delegate after delegate rose to express deep sympathy for the plight of the Jewish refugees. Yet they followed these expressions of compassion with firm declarations of their own nation's inability to offer substantial help. The American representative, Myron C. Taylor, adhered to the pre-conference stipulation, offering only to fill the existing restrictive German-Austrian quota of approximately 27 people. The British delegation argued that its territories were already full and that Palestine, under its mandate, could not accept a large influx of Jews due to the potential for increased conflict with the Arab population. The delegate from Australia delivered a particularly blunt refusal, stating that his country had no real racial problem and was not desirous of importing one. Other nations cited the ongoing economic depression, high unemployment, and concerns about social cohesion as reasons for closing their doors. The French claimed they had reached their point of saturation for refugees. Country after country echoed these sentiments, creating a chorus of polite regret and firm inaction. The only nation to offer a concrete proposal was the Dominican Republic, which agreed to accept up to 100 refugees. The German government observed the proceedings from afar, cynically noting the international hypocrisy. The Nazi press gloated that the world was criticizing Germany for its treatment of Jews, yet no one would take them in. The failure at Evian sent a clear and fatal message to the Nazi regime. The international community would not stand in the way of their anti-Jewish policies. The doors of escape were effectively barred, trapping hundreds of thousands of people in the Reich on the eve of a war that would seal their fate. And then the World War II began.